Deborah Smith encountered the usual bustle of the airport. People hurried past, pushing each other with suitcases and carts. Flight announcements sounded incessantly, the crowd in the queues buzzed, getting lost in this maelstrom. She awkwardly made her way to the check-in counter, clutching worn bags of homemade food in her hands. In her 68 years, Deborah Smith had seen a lot, but this was the first time she had ever been on a flight. It was clear that a simple cleaning lady could only dream of going to the sky. You can't travel if you can barely make ends meet all your life. But there was no way to refuse. My only son invited me to visit. And it didn't matter that it was to fly to the other side of the country. It didn't matter that all the money would have to be spent. Just to see the wayward but dear boy. Deborah Smith hadn't realized how fast he'd grown up. Yesterday he seemed to be just crawling on the floor. And today he was a grown man, living in a big city. He has a job. What kind of job he has, he won't tell me. But it doesn't matter, as long as he didn't starve, as long as he lived in warmth. And she's baked some guests homemade pies, cutlets, and jam. 3 jars, all her favorites from childhood. I could just imagine how happy Jason would be, how he'd eat his mom's goodies with both cheeks. He looked so gaunt on his last visit. Men can't take care of themselves. Thoughts and memories tangled with one another. And Deborah Smith did not notice how she reached the coveted counter. Her hand had already reached to put the bags on the conveyor belt, but suddenly a young guard stopped her. "Citizen, would you be so kind as to show me what you have there?" Confused, Deborah Smith began to explain the gifts to her son. She tried to open the bag. With shaking hands, the guard pulled one of them open himself, unceremoniously dumping the contents out. "So what do we have here?" He examined each container meticulously. Some kind of pies, some kind of cutlets. "And what is this, jam?" "Well, open it." The meticulous inspection seemed to take forever. The guard twirled each container in his hands, sniffing, asking Deborah Smith new questions. "Did you cook this yourself? Why is it in a glass container? Are you sure this is just jam?" At the back of the line, murmurs and sighs had already begun. Deborah Smith felt very uncomfortable. She kept apologizing and explaining, but the guard, as if he didn't hear, was stubborn and continued his exhortation. "According to the rules, the transportation of liquids and home-cooked food is restricted," he finally said as he unloaded the last can. "But so be it. As an exception, I'll allow it. But prepare more carefully next time." "Oh, thank you, honey," Deborah Smith exhaled with relief as she carefully stowed the gifts back. Her hands were visibly trembling with excitement. She got the lock on the bag and went on her way. But before she could take a couple steps, an angry voice came from behind her. "Hey, you old thing, hold up." Deborah Smith flinched and turned around. Standing right behind her was a man in an expensive suit, clearly accustomed to command and not recognizing rejection. His hands were covered with bracelets on his wrists, and one of them was wearing a massive watch, his boots shining as if they were lacquered. But most frightening of all were the eyes, prickly, full of contempt and arrogance. "My God, what have I done to him?" Deborah Smith thought confusedly and said calmly. "I'm sorry, I didn't do it on purpose. I was held up by security. I didn't want to disturb anyone. And I don't care whether it was on purpose or not." The man shouted. "Because of you, you old wreck, I might miss my plane. Have you looked at your watch? Do you think that if you have one foot in the grave, you can ruin the lives of others?" The insults came like lashes, scalding like lashes. Deborah Smith stood there, crumpling her bag in her hands and not knowing where to fall from shame. She was used to humiliation in her long life, but she had not seen such blatant, gratuitous rudeness in a long time. "All right, I'll forgive you for the first time," the rich man muttered, apparently tired of his own shouting. "But if you get in my face again, blame yourself," and proudly walked away, accompanied by the frightened looks of the queue. Deborah Smith remained standing as if petrified, confused, destroyed, broken. "Woman, are you all right? Are you feeling ill?" someone's voice asked sympathetically, bringing Deborah Smith out of her stupor. She looked up and saw a young girl in a stewardess uniform standing right in front of her. She looked at her with genuine concern and sympathy. Only now did Deborah Smith realize that she had tears running down her cheeks. Embarrassed, she wiped them away with her handkerchief and murmured, "It's all right. "My daughter, it's all right. It's your own fault. I delayed the people with the queue." "Oh, come off it," exclaimed the girl eagerly. "It was he who had no right to treat you like that." A bore and a rude man. Deborah Smith only shook her head. But how could one explain to this pretty young thing what it was like to be humiliated at home and at work all one's life? And even here, in front of strangers, you have to endure abuse. You get used to it, try to accept it, and stop expecting anything else. The girl kept saying something. She seemed to assure him that she would try to talk to the rude man and call him to order. But Deborah Smith was no longer listening, only nodding and thanking crudely. All her thoughts were occupied with the forthcoming flight and the meeting with her son. She did not notice how she finally checked in, got to her seat on the airplane, sat down and buckled herself in, freezing like a little lump. Everything inside was shaking with fear and excitement. Lord help me. I wish I could fly. I wish I could see my son. Deborah Smith closed her eyes. Meanwhile, in the next row, a battle was raging. I will not tolerate inappropriately dressed passengers on my airplane. Get this old woman off this flight immediately. Deborah Smith recognized the voice instantly. The same angry rich man who had insulted her at the airport. Her heart dropped. That's it. It's over. They're going to drop me off. I'm not going anywhere, ran through her mind. But let me, man, she hasn't violated anything. She has a ticket. She checked in. Came the same ringing voice of the stewardess who had interceded for her earlier. Only now there was uncertainty in her tone. Of course she did. Who was she up against? I don't care. Take this bag of bones out. The rich man's voice oozed anger and triumph. It was obvious that he enjoyed the scandal. But Deborah Smith only froze, clutching the armrests of her chair with white fingers. No, not this. She has endured so much, waited so long for this day. Has it all been for nothing? Look, with all due respect, this woman has a right to fly, the stewardess babbled. But there was no longer the same confidence in her voice, only trepidation and a willingness to give up. Who is she to contradict a rich man? Deborah Smith thought bitterly. Kind, but not strong. Now she'll break, she'll give in. But the violent argument was suddenly interrupted by a confident male voice. Pardon me for interfering. This is the crew commander speaking. I will not allow you to disembark a female passenger without good reason. Fasten your seatbelts, we're taking off. The stewardess nimbly rushed to her seat. The rich man grumbled and cursed, but obeyed. The airplane hummed and took off. And Deborah Smith sat there, neither alive nor dead, repeating to herself as if she were running, Lord, help me. Holy Mother of God, you have interceded, and thought through her tears. What a terrible and shameful for this day. It would seem to have done nothing, and the heart as if torn to shreds. I wish I could fly sooner. I wish I could hug my son. All I can do for now is to endure, as I have endured all my life. Deborah Smith was shocked. She had never imagined that a normal flight to her son would turn out to be such a nightmare. Not only did she have to endure a humiliating search and insults from a rude rich man, but now there was a scandal on the airplane. And the stewardess during the flight tried to intercede for the unfortunate woman, several times approached the seat of the rich man, urging him to calm down and not to violate the rules of behavior. But the man would not listen to anything. Who are you to tell me what to do? He shouted in anger. I'm an airline passenger, by the way. Yes, I'll find a way to deal with you. Sue me. The stewardess was embarrassed by the pressure. She knew this angry guy could cause a lot of trouble, but she couldn't leave her grandmother in the lurch. She knew all too well what it was like to be humiliated and helpless. Please, let's settle this peacefully, calmly, she began. But the rich man only grew more agitated. Peacefully? I'll throw you out of your good job, you inept. You found yourself a protector. And one more word, he shrieked. You'll spend your life scrubbing latrines. Like that old poker. What a bore, thought the stewardess bitterly. She was literally shaking with indignation and resentment for her grandmother. But the fear of losing her favorite job was stronger. She had dreamed of becoming a stewardess since childhood. How her mother could spend hours listening to her stories about flying, distant countries, and interesting people. She imagined how she herself would soar above the clouds, giving passengers smiles and comfort. But one day there was grief. Her father, who worked in an aerospace agency, died during the testing of a new airplane. Everything collapsed overnight. Mother, after the tragedy, went into herself, began to drink, and soon went blind. And faded away in the incomplete 40 years. Young Ashley had a hard time, but there was always a favorite grandmother, strict, but infinitely kind and caring. Only thanks to her, Ashley learned, grew up, and achieved her dream. And now, seeing how an innocent old woman was being unfairly insulted, Ashley just couldn't stay away. But she had to keep herself within the guidelines for the sake of her favorite job and her parents' memory. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. The rich man, who'd done such a low thing, grinned triumphantly, pleased with his power. For the rest of the flight, he glared at her with derogatory glances, hurling insults through his teeth. Ashley just clenched her fists until they crunched, until they hurt. She'd find a way to teach the boor a lesson. They landed, luckily, without any problems. Deborah Smith got up from her seat and walked over to Ashley. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, touching her arm. "You stood up for me. You were kind. God bless you." Tears came to Ashley's throat. She looked at her grandmother's wrinkled, kind face and saw in it the features of her late grandmother. Just as tough, tried and tested, but still loving people. "Don't mention it," Ashley murmured embarrassedly. "Anyone in my position would do that, but you can't let a man be hurt." Deborah Smith shook her head. "Oh dear, I wish everyone would think so. What's your name?" "Ashley." "Well, I gotta go, Ashley. My son's waiting." "He's been waiting." Deborah Smith smiled warmly at Ashley and hurried to the exit, dragging her small bags of goodies. The stewardess felt a sudden urge to protect this alien, but already as if she were her own grandmother. To talk to her, to ask her about her life, maybe even to help her get home. Somehow it seemed that they must meet again. The decision came lightning fast. Ashley had a quick word with the crew chief, asked for an hour off, and sprinted to catch up. Deborah Smith, she didn't know what she was going to say or how she was going to explain her impulse. She just felt she had to. I needed someone to support and encourage this lonely woman. Her grandmother was insulted. Just at least listened to her, hugged her, gave her tea. After all, everyone should have a guardian angel. Deborah Smith was already at the airport exit, looking around in confusion, clearly not sure where to go next. Deborah Smith, Ashley called out to her. Grandma turned around and was surprised to recognize her recent protector. "Ashley, I didn't expect that," she said with a smile. Ashley ran up to her and smiled radiantly. "You know what, Deborah Smith? I'm taking a break here. Why don't you let me walk you out, Jake, with your gifts? You'll get lost in the city." Grandma flapped her arms. "Oh, come on, honey. How could I? You've got work to do." But Ashley immediately grabbed her bags and took her grandmother under her arm. "How are you doing? The most important thing is to be a good person. You've been through so much today. Now it's my turn to take care of you." Deborah Smith only shook her head in admiration and unexpected joy. Rachel was already drawing her forward and chattering merrily about all sorts of things. Rachel and Deborah Smith walked leisurely through the streets of the unfamiliar town, occasionally checking the address on a piece of paper. Grandmother was a surprisingly talkative companion. As if sensing a kindred spirit, she eagerly shared her memories. "Rachel, dear, if you knew how much I love my little boy," she said with a sad smile. "He's a good, kind boy, but he's a little boy who can't sit still." She began to tell me that she had adopted Brendan when she was quite old. The lonely cleaning lady liked the orphan very much with his keen, intelligent eyes and simple-mindedness. And Deborah Smith herself very much wanted to find the meaning of life, to warm, caress a tiny, lonely creature. All was well at first. Brendan grew up an intelligent, affectionate boy. The soul did not dote in the foster mom, and everything helped. Only in high school we somehow fell apart. Deborah Smith sighed, recalling those difficult years. He got mixed up with a bad crowd, started skipping school and coming home late. I coaxed him, I scolded him. I cried. But he didn't give a damn. I thought he'd come to his senses in the army, but he didn't. Brendan never settled down. He took odd jobs, got involved in some dubious ventures. After that, he was like a tumbleweed across the country. He would go fishing in the Far East or to construction in Siberia. and all to no avail. And now he's probably planning to go to the end of the world for some other adventure. Deborah Smith splashed her hands. I'm in my 70s. I have no health, and I have to take care of him as best I can, because I'm the only one he has. Rachel listened in silence to these sorrows and saw that, in spite of everything, the mother loved her stupid son. She loved him self-consciously, blindly, and was ready to give her last. And Rachel felt sorry for this kind, tortured woman to the point of tears. He wanted to do something to ease her lot, to comfort and support her. Soon they found themselves on the right street. They found the house where the rebellious Brendan and his partner lived. Deborah Smith timidly rang the doorbell, holding her breath. 1 minute, another, no one opened the door. Oh my, she muttered in surprise. He's not here. What a fidget, God forbid. At last there was some rustling and mumbling behind the door. Then the lock clicked. A young woman appeared on the doorstep, her hair disheveled and puffy, her gait swaying. What do you want? She squeezed out hoarsely, glaring vaguely at the strangers. She reeked of booze and smoke. Deborah Smith staggered backward, startled by what she saw, but quickly pulled herself together and babbled on, smiling harder. Hello, Sydney. Didn't you recognize me? I'm your mother. I thought I'd come and see you. Here, I brought some goodies. She held out a bag of food. But her daughter-in-law made no attempt to let the guests in. Mommy's here, she said angrily, and for nothing. Your sorrowful son is gone. He's gone to work, his precious. And I'm all alone here. And Sydney launched into an angry tirade, every now and then breaking into a shout. Brendan was spending all his money on himself, going out with women, and he didn't even give her a second thought. If she'd known what kind of asshole she'd run into, she never would have gotten involved with him. Deborah Smith stood there, clutching the unfortunate bag, and her sister-in-law, on the rampage, began to swing, trying to snatch the bag. A little more and definitely would have hit her mother-in-law in the face, not disdaining anything. But Rachel couldn't stand it, stepped forward, shielded her grandmother, and glared angrily at the raging fury. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Deborah Smith has come to see you and has brought your young man some presents, and you've got your fists on her. How can you yell at an elderly person? She seemed to be jammed on them, and from the unexpected rebuff, she started with a new vigor, spitting saliva and profanity. She called the old woman names, calling her 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 names. Rachel also raised her voice in response, trying to calm her down, but to no avail. They argued on the doorstep for about 5 minutes, until Deborah became completely unhinged. Deborah Smith slowly pulled Rachel aside. Daughter, come on, let's get out of here. It's probably not the right time, she said. But she didn't give up, looking regretfully at her unhappy grandmother. There was no point in arguing further, only to upset Deborah Smith even more. She picked up the bags, put her arm around her shoulders, and led her away from the inhospitable house. Behind them, Jason was still cursing and cursing at the drunken Jason. But Rachel wasn't listening. Staring ahead, Sydney was frantically thinking of ways to help her new friend. She couldn't leave her alone in a strange city in such a depressed state, could she? Maybe convince her to go home, or try to find Brendan again, because she should try to talk to him. It was as if Deborah Smith had read her mind. Sighing heavily, she muttered, "All the same, we must go." Rachel replied, Come, Deborah Smith, let's go and find your Brendan. He won't get away from us. We'll have a heart-to-heart talk." Grandmother gratefully took Rachel's hand and pressed her lips together stubbornly. "Yes, Rachel, if this is the case, we have to go through with it. I'll go to work, I'll be patient, but I'll look him in the eye." And Deborah Smith strode resolutely forward, clutching her long-suffering bag of goodies. The stubborn grandmother, in spite of her fatigue and recent shocks, was moving toward her goal with remarkable steadfastness. Soon they were standing at the door of the firm where Deborah Smith had said that her troublemaking Brendan worked. Shyly, she opened the heavy door and peered inside. Rachel followed, looking around curiously. She was struck by the sparseness of the furnishings: bare walls, dusty windows, ancient furniture, and no one around but the emptiness of the corridor. Suddenly, footsteps and loud voices came from around the corner. Deborah Smith roused herself, prepared to rush toward her son. But the words of greeting froze on her lips. From around the corner, still muttering to himself, came the rich, scandalized man from that very flight. The same boorish and rude man who had abused the poor grandmother. Deborah Smith froze. The blood rushed to her face, and the rich man froze, half-stepping as he saw them. "Who do I see?" He grinned, his lips curling into a gloating smirk. "The old witch is here. What an insistent one." A young man in a cheap suit with frightened eyes peered over his shoulder. Deborah Smith gasped, clamping her hand over her mouth. "Brendan. Sonny." The boy jerked as if struck by a blow. A storm of emotions flashed across his face: surprise, confusion, fear, and even something akin to shame. But in the eyes of the rich man standing next to him, there was already unconcealed rage. "What kind of circus is this?" he shouted, glaring at the confused guard. "Why the hell did you bring your mother here, you idiot?" And this defender of the poor and the weak, he shifted his contemptuous gaze to the pale Rachel. Brendan staggered under his superior's threatening shout, pulling his head into his shoulders. I didn't call you. They came to you," he mumbled. "You're right, get out of here," the rich man shouted, sputtering. "Now, before I call the police." He turned on his heels and sped away, muttering angrily to himself. And poor Brendan stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at his mother. "You've got to be kidding me," he breathed out, shrugging nervously. "But who asked you to come here and fight with my boss?" "I didn't know." Deborah Smith began to babble, clutching her bag in her hands. Deborah Smith looked at Rachel with a startled look as Brendan lashed out at her. This was already too much. Brendan's temper flared. Fear for himself must have overpowered any vestiges of kinship. "You're always meddling where you're not wanted. Are you going to get me fired from my job?" Deborah Smith froze, stunned by this sudden outburst, and her grandson cried more and more. "That's it. I've had enough. I don't want you here. You're nothing but trouble." He grabbed the bag from his mother and threw it in Rachel's direction. "What are you looking at? Take your grandmother and get the both of you out of here." Rachel picked up the bag. Deborah Smith stood stone still. Only her lips moved soundlessly and large tears rolled down her cheeks. Rachel's heart clenched with a pang of pity and anger. But it was useless to resent her. How to reach a man in whom fear had overpowered conscience and kindred feelings? Rachel only gently put her arm around Deborah Smith's shoulders and gently led her away from that horrible place, away from the stiffness of her own grandson. Home they flew in heavy silence. Deborah Smith was sobbing quietly, holding a wet handkerchief in her hands. Rachel clutched her palm tightly, not knowing how to comfort her. What could be said? Any words would be meaningless or false. The only thing Rachel could do was to negotiate with the crew to allow Deborah Smith to board the flight for free, given her age and circumstances. The pilots and flight attendants readily complied, no one wanting to traumatize the poor woman further. The whole flight Deborah Smith sat a pale shadow, staring blankly at one point, only occasionally muttering to herself, "What in God's name have I done?" Rachel pulled away from the curious passengers, trying to shield her grandmother from unnecessary attention and questioning. On the ground, Deborah Smith suddenly stirred and grabbed Rachel's hand. "Rachel, darling, thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. I'm sorry for causing so much trouble," she sobbed, wiping away her tears. Rachel threw her arms around her, desperate for some kind of support. "Come on, Deborah, don't apologize." "For what? I'm so glad I could help you. Just hang in there. Things will get better, you'll see." As she said goodbye, Grandma slipped Rachel a slip of paper with her address and phone number. It's just in case. Maybe fate would bring them together again. Rachel hurriedly wrote down her address. Deborah Smith left, leaning heavily on her wand. Rachel stared after her, holding the sheet in her hands. It was too much for her to part, knowing that her grandmother was returning to an empty house all alone. She couldn't shake the pangs of guilt and helplessness. She wanted so much to do something more for Deborah, to help, to support her. But alas, it was time to return to her duties at the airport, to new flights and passengers. She took one last longing glance at the departing figure and hurried to board. Her heart ached with an acute sense of foreboding. It was as if Rachel knew that their destinies with Deborah Smith would cross more than once. And what if the next meeting was no less dramatic and bitter? After all, Rachel had noticed with what sharpened malice and calculation the rich man was looking at her poor grandmother, as if he were mentally preparing a new attack on her. And for some reason it seemed to Rachel that Brendan would have to pay for it. After all, why would this guy stay in the service of such a scumbag? This was clearly not a simple security office, but a real hotbed of crime, where disenfranchised subordinates worked for their powerful bosses. Oh, this is not good, Rachel thought for the umpteenth time, leaning back tiredly in the airplane seat. She smelled trouble and knew she would have to get involved in this ugly story again. After all, she just couldn't let it go. Deborah Smith had no right to. Rachel sighed and covered her eyes. There was still a long way to go before disaster struck, and in the meantime she could nap for an hour or two, gather her strength for new challenges. And there would be new trials. She had no doubt about that. The airplane hummed, taking her away from the city, where a part of her soul remained, to the place where her life was waiting for her. On the way home, Rachel found herself thinking hard. The story of Deborah Smith never left her mind, how unfair life could be to good people. Her own fate, however, seemed about to strike another blow. When she entered the apartment, Rachel stood on the threshold as if struck by thunder. In the living room, her fiancé John was sitting on the couch, cuddled up with some girl. They were selflessly kissing, not paying any attention to the world around them. Rachel's eyes darkened with confusion and resentment. In her own home in broad daylight. What kind of circus is this? She squeezed out, struggling to speak. John shuddered and bounced away from Deborah Smith's poopy-haired girlfriend. She wrinkled her nose in annoyance but didn't get up from the couch. She gave Rachel an indifferent glance and snickered. Oh, come on, your husband is not the first day on the ladies. Why throw tantrums? And you can see that Rachel, from the shock, cannot utter another word. The girl got up reluctantly and headed for the exit. She turned around at the door and gave a final glance. Claire. You don't think I should go to her, do you? You want to have some fun? Xiao. And she was gone. And Rachel was still standing there like she'd swallowed her tongue. She couldn't get her head around what was happening. John quickly came to his senses, showing genuine remorse on his face, and rushed to his fiancée. Rachel, honey, I'm sorry. I'm out of my mind, for God's sake. I don't know what came over me. Never again, I give you my word. He tried to hug and kiss her, to justify himself. But Rachel's fiancé squeamishly pulled away. Pain and rage mixed with disgust boiled up inside. Get out. She gritted her teeth, barely able to keep from screaming. Now, before I break your face, and take your things so you won't be here anymore. John shrank back and tried to mumble something in his own defense, but when he saw the look of anger on Rachel's face, he realized it wouldn't work. It would be the worst thing in the world to mess with someone like that. He lowered his nose and began to throw his things into his bag. You're a fool, Rachel, he muttered, rummaging in the closet. Men go out, and it's okay. And you're so hysterical. So what if I was with a woman? Not in a brothel. She kept silent with her arms crossed over her chest, and dreamed only of one thing, that this nightmare would end quickly, that her eyes would never see this traitor and traitor again. Finally, the door slammed shut behind John. There was a ringing silence in the apartment. Emptiness. Rachel sank to the couch without strength. Tears choked in her throat, constricted with a cramp. So much for love to the grave. So much for loyalty. There was a reason she was so reluctant to get attached. Well, that's fine. Better to be alone than with someone like John. The next few days passed like a blur. Rachel mechanically ate, slept, went to work, and in her soul it was as if a black hole had formed, sucking in all thoughts and feelings. She forbade herself to think about Killian, chased away all memories of him. But it didn't make it any easier. At least no one at work asked her questions, seeing her gloomy, detached face. Colleagues sympathetically looked at her and nodded sympathetically, saying that she would change. The days dragged on in an endless, dreary succession. Rachel often thought back, wondering how Deborah Smith had settled in, whether she was all right. She wanted to call, but at the last moment stopped herself. She didn't want to reopen fresh wounds, to remind herself of the failed meeting with her son. And then Deborah Smith showed up. Rachel was just getting ready for her evening flight when the doorbell rang demandingly. Grandmother stood on the doorstep, sorrowful and trembling. "Oh my God, she's here. She's definitely on her last legs," Rachel thought to herself. "What happened?" she asked. Troubled Deborah Smith breathed out and almost fell, but was barely picked up by Rachel. When the water and sedative were finished, Deborah Smith, stammering and choking back tears, broke the terrible news. Brendan had been arrested, accused of some horrible crime, threatened with a huge sentence. And he's not guilty of anything. She knows that. That creep who was abusing us on the airplane. He set it all up," whispered Deborah Smith, wringing her wet handkerchief in her hands. "I know it, Rachel. Do you remember when he looked at us like a wolf? So he got his revenge, Herod. He wrote a statement, accused him of all the deadly sins, the one who didn't plow, and the cases inside. Of course, nothing surprising, this scumbag could not just let the offense go. She quite believed he was the one who'd set the guy up for some dirty purpose. After all, he'd been nasty to his mom, and she'd hit him hard, but to rot in jail for nothing. Rachel's heart ached with sympathy and anger. "Don't cry, Deborah Smith," she said firmly. "We'll think of something. We'll get through this." Rachel had no idea what she could think of, but she knew for sure that she could not sit idly by. She had to act, to fight for the sake of the poor boy and his grief-stricken mother. After all, she had the main trump card on her hands, the opportunity to get close to Jeremy Winston. Since he was now a regular on her flights, she could get him to come clean, nail him to the wall, make him confess to his meanness. Luckily, the nearest flight was the one the damn rich guy usually took. Jeremy Winston was his name. Rachel was determined to take the bull by the horns this time. And of course, she was keeping Deborah Smith. Almost all the way to the airport, Rachel was preparing for the decisive conversation. She was going through all possible arguments in her head, choosing the right words, even composed a farewell speech in case the rich man would take revenge and she would be fired. But all plans went to shit. As soon as Rachel entered the VIP lounge and came face to face with Jeremy Winston, he was sitting in a chair, writing something in a notebook. "You're a fledgling," he said, glancing casually at Rachel. "Are you here to defend the poor again? There doesn't seem to be anyone else." The mocking tone and smirk of the man's sneer made Rachel instantly furious. What kind of politeness and arguments are there? This bore immediately signed his name to all of his art. The only thing to expect from him was the truth. "What do you mean, no one?" "Links." "With what?" Rachel blurted out with rage in her voice. "And Brendan Adams, Deborah Smith's son, who you framed, he's behind bars now because of you." Jeremy Winston froze before his fork reached his mouth. Then he laughed loudly and mockingly. "Tina, you're so hot. What's this got to do with me? You didn't hit your head, did you, beautiful?" His insolence made my eyes darken. No, that's just out of line. Such a cold-blooded, shameless lie. "You know very well," she whispered, clenching her fists. "It was you who filed the report against him. You wanted revenge to frame him." Jeremy Winston stopped laughing. He gave Rachel a scornful look and said coldly, "Honey, I think you're being paranoid. Why would I want to frame some security guard? I have nothing else to do. And it's none of your damn business. Go meet the passengers, if that's what you want." He looked away, squeamishly, indicating that the conversation was over. And Rachel felt as if something inside her had snapped. "Oh, is that it? You don't know anything?" She thought frantically, walking away. "Well, let's see how you'll sing when I've got you up against the wall. When I tell the whole world what a scoundrel you are." She had no idea how she was going to get the bastard. But she knew for sure that she would get what she wanted, no matter what. For now it was necessary to gather her thoughts and urgently think of a plan of action. The first thing to do was to reassure Deborah Smith, to give her hope. And then there would be a way to put pressure on the rich man. "You've got the wrong girl, you bastard," Rachel repeated stubbornly to herself as she stepped into the airplane. Determination, anger gave her strength. She knew she would save Brendan. For the sake of her grandmother. for the sake of justice, and for the sake of her own belief that evil must be punished. Jeremy Winston would regret this. Of that she had no doubt. Deborah Smith was beside herself with grief and worry. Rachel did her best to comfort her, to inspire her with hope. How could a mother sit still when she knew that her own child was suffering innocently? They spent hours in the kitchen. Rachel made plans, thought of options. Grandmother once again told her how Brendan was a good boy, but only a careless one. And at the end of it, she was always in tears, bemoaning the fate of the wicked. "Why is he being punished like this, Rachel?" She sobbed, clutching her wet handkerchief in her hands. He was a fool, a young man. He was foolish enough to get mixed up with that scoundrel. Is that what you should go to jail for? Rachel realized that it was not Brendan's foolishness or his careless connections, but the meanness and vindictiveness of the man he had had the misfortune to cross. Or rather, not himself, but his mother, by her integrity and independence. Well, nothing, Rachel thought gloomily, stroking her grandmother's shaking hands. "I'll get you yet. I'll remember everything, the abusive grandmother, and the frame-up with her son." But all plans for revenge were shattered when Deborah Smith began to feel ill one evening. She had suffered too many shocks. In the last few days, her aged heart had failed, her body shuddering like a hunted bird. Rachel paced around the apartment, unable to find a place for her anxiety. The paramedics arrived surprisingly quickly, but as they placed the unconscious Deborah Smith on a stretcher, the faces of the team were glum and worried. "Let's get her to the emergency room," the doctor said, without looking at Rachel. "She's in serious condition. Are you a relative?" "IA," mumbled the dazed girl. Rachel was in a daze. She rushed from corner to corner to corner of the hospital corridor, trying time and again to enter the intensive care unit. They wouldn't let her in, of course. All she could do was wait and pray that Deborah Smith would pull through. By the end of the first 24 hours, spent almost without sleep or food, Rachel resembled her own shadow. Dark circles under her eyes. Her cheeks were sunken. There was a deep crease in her forehead. Even the most cheerful nurses looked at her with pity. It was then that the doctor who had attended Deborah Smith appeared in the hallway, a tall, stately man in his 40s with piercing gray eyes and a strong-willed chin. Rachel rushed toward him. "Well, how is she?" The doctor felt sorry for the girl. He cast her an attentive, studying look. "Condition is stable to serious. The crisis has passed. But tell me, are you definitely related to her?" Rachel was confused for a moment, not knowing how to explain. "Yes, it's just that she and I are very close. I should be close." The doctor frowned. It was obvious he was hesitating, not knowing if he could trust a girl he didn't know. But something in Rachel's face, in her haggard eyes, seemed to convince him. "All right," he sighed. "Let's go. Just briefly and very gently. She can't be worried." For the next few days, Rachel practically took up residence in the hospital. Day and night she sat by Deborah Smith's bedside and helped the nurses. She went home to sleep only for a couple of hours, and then rushed back, afraid to miss even the slightest change. The Dr. Jeremy Winston at first squinted disapprovingly, but, seeing the devotion of the girl, gradually began to talk to Rachel for a long time, to explain the features of treatment, and even consult on some issues. It turned out that they had a lot in common. Jeremy also lost his parents early and chose a profession to help people, and their characters were similar, purposeful, uncompromising. It came out, of course, that purely business communication turned into friendship, and romance was not far behind. Jeremy would bring Rachel coffee and homemade pies, a strange hobby for a doctor cooking. Then she would meet him after a night duty, tired and a little killed, and they would go for a walk in the nearest park. Deborah Smith was recovering slowly but surely, but she refused to go home. Rachel herself had grown fond of her grandmother. She realized that Deborah could not be alone in four walls. Now she would wither from longing for her son Brendan. So Deborah moved in with Rachel. But not for good. She rented out her apartment. She began to save money to help Brendan, then went to the detention center to her son, then to lawyers. Rachel could barely hold back her tears. True, while Deborah was ill, she was fired from the firm where she worked as a cleaner. It's understandable the office should be clean. But Grandma was still terribly upset. "And here did not please, and there did not come out," bitterly whispered Sydney, dropping tears in a cup of tea. "Why should I have such a share? Rachel, wherever you go, there's a wedge." Rachel hugged her and stroked her gray head, soothing her as best she could. "It's okay, we'll get through this. Your health is the main thing, and the rest will come." And feverishly thought how to help. She couldn't do much on her paycheck alone, and Deborah had to carry Brendan's packages and pay the rent. Jeremy Winston was supportive, offering to find Deborah Smith a lighter job with a flexible schedule. Rachel put her arms around him and pressed herself against him, her throat constricted with the sensation. "God, Jeremy, what would I do without you? You're a miracle, not a man." He grinned, kissing her gently on the top of her head. "Rachel, what kind of miracle? Helping people close to you is normal, humanly speaking." And he looked at her in a way that made her chest squeeze with happiness and pain. Lord, did I really find mine? Despite all the loss, the turmoil, despite all the injustice of the world, she wrapped her arms around his neck and reached up for a kiss. There were still many challenges ahead, but now, at this moment, Rachel believed that they could do it. Together they could make mountains for the truth, for love, and for the fragile hope that it was stronger. Rachel's mind was consumed with worrying about Deborah Smith. Most of her earnings now went to her for medicine, food, small needs. She didn't think much of herself, as long as grandmother didn't need anything. At first, Deborah Smith was reluctant, shy. "Oh, come on, Rachel, don't. How am I supposed to pay it back? I'm not working now," she repeated. But Rachel wouldn't listen. "What's the use, Deborah?" She was genuinely surprised. "You became like my mother, and you don't think about mothers you don't have to. They just help them from the bottom of their hearts." Grandmother, tears ran up, gustily hugged her named daughter, and no longer argued, only prayed. Rachel was annoyed that because of her, the old wench young denies herself everything. But Rachel was adamant, even though she herself had a little more than a share of macaroni and tea with dried bread. She didn't complain. Jason wasn't discouraged. Of course, he knew what was going on. He tried to slip her money more than once, but Rachel just waved it away. "And you're the same way, with all those handouts. I'm fine. I'll get by somehow." But Jason was persistent. One day he interrogated Rachel, and in the end he found out about her financial problems, her worries about Brendan, and her fear of the rich, abusive man. "Rachel," he lamented, hugging her tightly. "But why didn't you say so in the first place? I want to help. You can't carry everything on your shoulders alone." They sat in the kitchen that night, drinking tea and discussing the situation. Jason, as always, was a treasure trove of good advice and rational ideas. "Okay," he said, stirring the sugar in his cup thoughtfully. "Brendan has to be taken out, that's a fact. Otherwise the kid will get killed in the detention center. But how? There's no evidence against him. The only thing that's holding up hope for him is your bigwig statement." "What do you mean?" "I don't get it." Rachel was staring straight ahead. "If he fabricated the case against Brendan, he's the only one who can close it. We need to get in touch with him, probe him. Maybe we can appeal to his conscience or make a deal." Rachel hummed bitterly, her eyes downcast, hiding the unsolicited tears. "But what conscience, Jason? He's got a stone for a heart. How can you get past that?" But tonight, Jeremy Winston set himself up. He called Rachel on the video link. He smirked. It was a short, rather nasty conversation. "Look, Camille, I may change my mind about taking a statement on your innocent Brendan, but not for nothing. You're going to have to work for it. So here's the deal, you'll be my mistress. Your Brendan goes free. If he doesn't, he'll put you in jail. It's up to you. I'll give you 24 hours to think about it." And he's out. And Rachel's mind went foggy. It took a lot of effort not to yell, not to use a lot of profanity against the bastard. And she burst into tears. She sobbed bitterly, hopelessly against Jason. He was worried, stroking Rachel's head, whispering affectionately, and then he suddenly woke up and snapped his fingers. "Rachel, let's blackmail him. You know, you're rich, man. Blackmail him with what? Are you out of your mind? Jason grinned. There was a sly twinkle in his eye. I have an idea. Rachel, he seems to like you, doesn't he? Well, maybe we should meet him, play a little prank on him. Something, fatal. Rachel listened, feeling something bad stirring in her soul. Scary, embarrassing, but at the same time daring and exhilarating. It's a tempting idea. You mean? She began tentatively. And it was Jason who picked up on it eagerly. Go on a date with him, flirt a little, and set up a secret camera somewhere so he'd lick himself and say things he couldn't get away with. And he'll start hitting on you, of course. That's when you catch him red-handed. He was so engrossed that he jumped up and ran around the kitchen, waving his arms. Rachel looked at him and couldn't believe her eyes. What was this, her quiet, sensible Brendan suggesting she lie to a man for blackmail? It was surreal. But it was a good plan. Unconventional, risky. But it could have an effect. Jeremy Winston's not going to be able to get away with it. He'd have to take the application. Otherwise, you could ruin your career or go to jail for harassment. Okay, Rachel exhaled, feeling her heart racing. He had only one question: where was the camera? And with good resolution so he could see his face. Brendan smiled enigmatically, and the next day brought a flat rectangle about the size of a pack of cigarettes. Where's the state-of-the-art spy tech? I got it cheap from an IT guy I know. It's got enough battery life for 5 hours. Write down your ideas. So go for it, girlfriend. Vindictiveness was with her. Setting up the camera at the hotel had to be done in a terrible hurry. Rachel purposely showed up early to the reserved Sheraton luxury suite, 2 bedrooms, bed, fireplace, and other frills. She had hidden the camera in a decorative niche. It would have a great view of the entire room. Jeremy Winston showed up for his date slightly inebriated. He ordered a bottle of champagne and fruit and grinned carnivorously. And Rachel was circling him, making eyes at him. Only it turned everything upside down. The calculation was right. The rich man quickly floated from drinking and flirting. He started kissing, grabbing Rachel by all places, and she squealed. The guests giggled and poured sparkling wine. When Jeremy Winston became quite bold and began to voice his obscene desires aloud, Rachel gently but decisively freed herself from his clutches, depicted on her face extreme embarrassment. "Oh, excuse me, I have to go to the ladies' room," she said, and flew out of the room with an arrow. Only in the hallway did she catch her breath. I think it worked. The next day, the tape with the ambiguous footage was on the investigator's desk. He shook his head glumly at first, but the evidence was there. A drunken rich man is so and blazing with lust, grabbing the struggling girl and talking all sorts of obscenities. It's pure molestation, that's for sure. Brendan was released after a couple days for lack of evidence. Jeremy Winston, on the other hand, was taken to task by law enforcement. He, of course, threatened all the punishments of heaven. Even the lawyers they hired, they couldn't do anything about it. The videotape is authentic. So are the rich guy's fingerprints on the glasses. And even DNA from the cigarette butts in the ashtray. Rachel and Brendan followed the story from afar, following the news and the gossip of acquaintances and chuckling furtively, exchanging understanding glances. Wow, how did everything work out? Just unreal. Brendan smirked, pulling Rachel close to him. Deserve to be happy. Don't dig another man a hole, you'll fall in it yourself. Bite you, you creepy crawly bastard, she squinted blissfully, resting her cheek against his chest. She couldn't believe her happiness. Was it really over? Were there only cloudless days ahead in the arms of her lover? There was no doubt in her mind that Brendan was her destiny. They'd been through too much together. Their sudden love was too strong to withstand fear, pain, and dirty backstage games. And Deborah Smith seemed pleased with her future son-in-law. She saw that her daughter was in safe hands, that her chosen one would not hurt her, would not betray her. One evening, when Brendan was about to go home, the old woman suddenly rose resolutely from her chair and took him by the hand. "Son," she whispered, and her voice trembled with excitement. "I can see how much you love Rachel. Thank you for not leaving us in the lurch, for helping us with all your heart." She brushed away a stingy tear and smiled brightly, enlightened. "Be a good husband, okay? And I'll pray for you now day and night. Happiness to you, my dears." And she crossed the dazed Brendan 3 times. And Rachel looked at them from the side and almost cried with emotion. There it was, the real blessing of happiness, of a long, honest life. Now Rachel sees herself at liberty, and Deborah Smith seems to be well, and all is well at work. Without noticing it herself, Rachel has become accustomed during this tumultuous time to taking care of others. It seemed so easy and right for someone else. She was afraid to get attached. She thought she wouldn't open her heart to people after Killian. I thought maybe that was the point of life, to fly solo, where no one was needed. God, what a fool I was. Only now, having found a real family, Rachel realized here it is. Happiness is not in money, not in the career, but to love and be loved, to feel your need, indispensability for those who are near. Beauty, what are you thinking about? Playfully pushed her in the side Andrew. Are you thinking of running away from me? Rachel woke up from her thoughts, and with a smile pressed herself against her lover. She cupped his neck with her hands and kissed his nose. Don't even think about getting rid of me. Andrew smiled happily, pulled her to him and whispered in her ear. I wasn't going to. You're my bird, my guiding star. You say. I love you. I can't stand it, he whispered, sending shivers down her spine. His heart beat in a frantic rhythm, each time as if it were the first time. Their lips came together in a long kiss. Outside the windows, the summer twilight was thickening. Crickets chirped in the grass, and the two lovers stood on the threshold of their common future, and were not afraid of anything, for now they were one. In the next room, Deborah Smith was serenely slumbering in her sleep, peaceful. The sorrows were behind them, and only joy lay ahead. After all, the grown-up and quiet Paul had come home. Bitter experience taught him a lot, and patience, and responsibility for his actions. Now all his free time he devoted to caring for his mother, helped around the house, took her for walks, to church. Grandmother could not be pleased with such changes. Every now and then she furtively wiped away tears of emotion, looking at him. Where will her son go now from loving hearts and caring hands? He would live like a man, work, atone for past mistakes. And Jeremy Winston, by all rights and wrongs, tried to hush up the scandal with harassment through trusted persons came to Rachel. They say, take the statement, refuse to testify, and you will be rewarded. She agreed and even went to the investigator, but kept the videotape just in case. Just try to touch us again, she caressingly warned the rich man who had turned white with impotent anger. Jeremy Winston gritted his teeth, but backed down. He had too much to lose because of his fleeting lust. Rachel was triumphant. So much for the ride. Know our people. Life was slowly returning to peacefulness. Almost every day Rachel met with Andrew, they went to the movies, or to a cafe to sit in a cafe, and even in the evening they wandered the streets, holding hands and talking about everything in the world, remembering the past trials. They made plans for the future. In their chests there was confidence. Now everything will definitely be fine. One evening Andrew took a velvet box out of his pocket, and a month later they were married. The same day as Brendan and his chosen one, Olivia, Tanya's partner and friend, a fragile blue-eyed flight attendant. They met at Rachel's house and got to talking. It turned out they had a lot in common. And when Olive learned the details of the story, she was completely taken in. They've been together ever since. Deborah Smith at this double wedding was more radiant than the young, spinning like a Yule log, helping with the preparations and receiving guests. At one point she pulled Rachel into a corner and kissed her on both cheeks. Rachel, darling, it's all you with your efforts before God cheers for you. What happiness you have brought us. Grandmother cried from the excess of feelings, but immediately left, again hurrying away. But I'm still running. The guests are waiting. Bitter. And plunged into the hustle and bustle of the wedding. Rachel did not see her off, feeling her throat tighten with tears. God, could she have imagined such an ending 6 months ago, that so many loving hearts would be united in one day in one registry office? And did she think that life would give her a real family? She didn't believe it. Annie, Brendan's ex-fiancée, showed up at the wedding, the same one who'd been rude the other day, and Deborah Smith drunkenly made an ugly row across the room, claiming she was pregnant with her fiancé's child. The guests were stunned, whispered. The young woman was upset. But the groom only squeamishly wrinkled his nose. Oh, give up these stories. A year ago and the couple was all boiling hot. She could not come to terms with the breakup, kept sobbing in her voice and tried to faint. That's when Andrew came up with a brilliant idea, and let's send the mommy-to-be to a blood test. Or at least a pregnancy test. I'm a doctor, by the way. He winked at Rachel, and she thanked him for her husband, who was not only handsome, but also smart. He figured out how to get her to come clean. Annie was about to get out of here, but she didn't. She had the wrong people. They rounded up the grief-stricken bride, put her in a cab, and took her straight to the nearest clinic. A couple of tests, and there was no pregnancy. Just a false alarm caused by alcohol abuse. The hapless liar only had to retreat in shame. And the wedding party went on until late into the night. Dancing, songs, laughter, kisses furtively, and endless hugs. Happiness was running wild. Rachel and Andrew often recalled that stormy, crazy day and agreed that there was no better start to married life. A mother with many children bought a house in the countryside with her last money and decided to dismantle the stove. Annie took one more look around her parents' apartment and her miserable belongings. What had she prepared for the journey? In the kitchen, the twins, her two favorite sweet couples, Megan and Emily, were finishing their tea and gnawing on one bagel for two. Sweet tooths, Tommy, Christian, Annie said. Another equally ruddy bagel and a bowl of apricot jam stood on the table. A car was due to pick them up in half an hour. There was still time to see if everything was packed for the long journey to her new life, which she did not know how it would turn out. The woman sat down heavily on a small stool in the hallway, sighed, tried to pull her thoughts together so she wouldn't cry. Not to win snot on her fist. She didn't like weaklings. And here you're going to go. She wanted to sob in her voice to the bone. 30 years down the drain. Childhood, youth, father and mother, her late husband. Did it all happen within the walls of this house? The apartment was dejectedly silent. Only on the landing the old elevator farted like an owl. Whether it was taking someone up or taking them down. Annie would never have sold her parents' inheritance if it hadn't been for fateful circumstances. Everything in life must be paid for, including insanely passionate love. That's fate, and billed her now at the full rate. Their home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles got Annie's parents honorably after hard work at the candy factory. The girl's father was an adjuster of production lines. It was thanks to his bright head on the conveyor belt smoothly rolled all these lush cakes, dressed with chocolate icing, beckoned sugar-colored marmalades. To the mother, sweet treasures a little later got to the packaging. The workers put the fragile products into colorful boxes marked "Made in the oldest candy factory in the USA." The soul rejoices without a premium. And if they also give a bonus, so in general, here it is, simple happiness. In stores, the goods flew off the shelves across the country, boxes of products dispersed, giving the staff of the confectionery factory and decent salaries by those standards to receive, and social benefits to enjoy. So the masters of tasty business got this two-room apartment. They furnished it with new furniture, a sofa, a TV set, a couple of armchairs, a floor lamp, a sideboard, crystal. This is in the living room, and in the bedroom, where the three of us slept for a long time, until Annie finally grew up and moved into the hall, put 3 beds. We have girls like the 3 bears in a fairy tale, Dad joked. The biggest bed for Papa Bear, the smaller one for Mama Bear, and the baby for their bear cub. Annie envisioned this picture and burst into a long, happy laugh. At that time, because of her young age, she did not think about why her parents slept in separate beds. There was already an irreversible distress living in the family. But at that time, Annie had little understanding of what was going on. They were endlessly happy. It seemed to the 3 of them that it could not be otherwise. Annie's mother was not allowed to have children in the sense of giving birth on her own. But she wanted a child so badly that she took the risk. Annie was born, and Isabella herself underwent a complicated operation after the birth. They didn't leave anything inside the childbearing chamber. Daddy tolerated for a long time honest wife. Even close relations with her husband were not recommended. And then, as if off the chain, could not miss a single skirt. Hunger flew out of the secret gut, like a cork from a bottle of champagne. Christian had been a model family man before the birth of his daughter, and afterwards he made a conscientious effort not to distance himself from his wife. But the male nature was stronger than all the vows made to himself. The first affair, Christian started on the side, released the genie on the loose. Now he wanted more and more adventures, more emotions and victories. Isabella was not in the clouds. She did not press her lips when she first found traces of lipstick on the collar of her husband's shirt. Isabella didn't faint from the perpetual swarm of feminine odors now always surrounding Christian. When he returned to the home in the late afternoon, it came as no shock to her when she realized her husband had been hit on in earnest by another woman. He even stopped going to the movies in the park with Annie, her daughter. On weekends, he'd come back late at night, spending long hours furiously scrubbing his tracks in the bathroom. Then he could spend hours on the balcony smoking one cigarette after another, agonizing. Isabella knew Christian was making a choice, and she sensed it would not be in her favor. The difficult conversation took place in the midst of spring. Birds were chirping outside the window and lilacs were fragrant in the yard. The fragrance wafted insistently through the open window into the kitchen, where Christian was explaining himself to Isabella. "I've met another woman, and it's stronger than I am. I don't live, I don't breathe, I don't exist if she's not around for even a few hours. I'll pay child support. But I can't go on living in this house, away from my beloved." Christian's things are packed. While Annie was in class, Isabella realized her husband had endured 8 whole years in a cold bed. His manhood was also short. Everything was inevitable from the time when she was made an inferior woman after childbirth. Surprisingly, there were no tears and wailing. She was too tired of feeling guilty, and she also knew something about herself put her again before the choice of having a daughter or a husband. She would choose a daughter again. A couple of months later, Isabella learned that Christian and his new wife had left for a shift in Norilsk. There, their traces were quickly lost under the snowdrifts. It was only 300 kilometers to the Arctic Circle. Christian kept his promise. He transferred the money to Annie accurately and on time. By the first day of each month, Isabella and her daughter were living together. But strangely enough, it was hardly noticed that now there were only girls in the house. Annie unequivocally took her mother's side in the divorce. "Mama, I'll always be there for you," she said seriously, as if she were an adult. "Men sometimes go off to other women. It's their nature." Isabella laughed heartily, hugged her budding daughter, and replied, "Someday, my good one, you will meet your man, your soul mate, and change your ironic attitude to the male sex. We will discuss this topic many times." Isabella was right on the money. Annie went from a little girl at 15 to a total beauty. You can sit down and paint a picture of her now. Light, slender, with big blue eyes, smooth long hair the color of coal anthracite, feminine, early formed figure. Classmates pelted her with notes with invitations to the movies or disco. But the heart of the young beauty was suddenly occupied. In the next doorway of their house lived a little swagger, but very handsome guy named Robert. The kind of guy that women of all ages turn around and cast languid glances at. Robert was ironic and cocky, superbly built, with a masculine brutality in his demeanor and gaze. What eyes there were seemed not to notice beside him. At the same time, past the female sex, he somehow passed indifferently. Dates did not impose. The thresholds of the house did not dwell. He worked as a lawyer in one of the Moscow law offices, dealt mainly with civil cases. And yet there was something subtly slippery, murky about him. Isabella could not even explain to herself why her heart was so tight when she caught her now 17-year-old daughter on duty at the window. Annie didn't even immediately realize that her mother was already there, and she was also looking at Robert, strolling toward her brand new foreign car. This young man was born with a golden spoon in his mouth. Dad is a diplomat, Mom is a theater actress. His parents were public figures in Moscow. They occupied a whole floor in their house, having bought and renovated 2 adjacent apartments at once. Not housing, but chalets in a quiet green neighborhood of the capital. The woman then thought, God, but why Isabella liked him? There is something about him that makes me suspicious, but I can't understand what it is. Matthew was 10 years older than Isabella. Between them lay a deep chasm of his life experience, his high school diploma, the beginning of his career, and her girlish naivete and purity as a 10th grade graduate. No miracle can happen. And that's great, thought Amelie to herself. He'll never pay attention to a girl. I mean, how many local and foreign girls have been hunting him? All of them have passed him by. He did. He stopped suddenly as Amelie and Annie were running, laden with groceries from the grocery store. He gallantly opened the door for them. He glanced at Isabella appraisingly, hummed something to himself, and the tray girl was stunned by his presence, frozen in front of the steps like a statue, while Amelie almost poked her in the back with her nose. And there's Matthew, That young man from the other Isabella, Amelie thought. Not his type. He'll break her heart. You won't know what hit you. Her daughter was embarrassed, but came to her senses quickly. I love him, Mom. I love him so much that I won't even listen to you this time. If he calls me to follow him anywhere, I'll go. I won't hesitate. These seconds are my choice. You'll have to accept that. A true daughter of her father, Amelie thought immediately. He, too, had fallen madly in love and refused to compromise. At least my inexperienced girl did not get into some unpleasant story with her unearthly love. Well, if fate has decreed so, it is only necessary to tell her that if she gets burned, the door of the house for her is always open. Amélie was pulled out of her memories of what her life with her handsome husband had been like by her daughter. Mom, we cleaned up the kitchen. When is the car coming to pick us up? You said that our new house in the countryside stands almost on the banks of the river, that around a dense forest with hares and squirrels. 86 years have already passed to my Arkarovsky, and all dream of adventures, thought Isabella with love. At least Matthew had left something light behind on this earth. What would I do? How would I live if I didn't have my magnificent foursome? Isabella stroked the curly heads of her older sons, tightened the colored rubber bands on the girls' ponytails, brushed the stockings of the girls with the little comb she always carried in all her pockets. Forward, my young princesses and knights. Great things await us, she said. The minibus she had hired was puffing away in the driveway. She looked back at the home she had lived in for 35 years and stepped boldly onto the step. Today closed a large and poignant page of her life. By evening, they would be in place in their newly purchased home 300 kilometers from Miami. Isabella had sold off all the furniture and utensils, rightly deciding that if she was starting her life from scratch, in a new place, let everything around her also be different, still unexplored. The old apartment all reminded her of the former failures and joys that had also been. And to anger God that she had not had many very happy days in her life, she would not. It would be quite unfair to fate evil. Presents in the form of bright universes of celestial life did send her. Isabella leaned back gracefully on the soft, comfortable back of the seat in the minibus, and again, indulging in memories, the twins chattered about something of their own in the back. For a while, she even forgot about the tragic events of the last 2 years and went back there, far away, to their amazing romance with Matthew. The first guy in their yard was waiting for her at the driveway the very next day, twirling his car keys on his finger and smiling his unimaginable smile. It was for her, Isabella. As she walked away from the driveway, he rushed to the back seat and pulled out a luxurious bouquet of delicate maroon roses with some beautiful pink veins. Your name is Isabella, isn't it, neighbor girl? He touched her hand with his fingers, and Isabella felt as if her skin was burned in that spot. Bella, the girl answered, stammering. And you are? She asked this stupid question, realizing perfectly well that he knew that she knew his name. Matthew smiled his charming smile once more and suddenly proposed. How about I show you my town? The one I'm crazy about. The one I know so well. The one that every other Miami resident sometimes never gets to visit in a lifetime. Isabella swallowed her saliva and answered guiltily. There's no way I can do that right now. I'm going to school for a physics tutorial. We have a final exam in a week. Matthew didn't raise an eyebrow, slipped the impossibly beautiful roses into her hands and replied. Then we'll postpone our date until after your final exams. He jumped into the front seat, deftly squeezing himself between the steering wheel and the back of the car seat. The engine rumbled softly like a contented March cat, and the car disappeared in a flash. Only Isabella remained standing in the yard, agonizingly trying to make a decision to go to the consultation directly with a gorgeous bouquet of roses and be on time, or to return home and put the bouquet in the most expensive vase of set crystal, but be late. In an argument with myself, the third solution was chosen. Her face was burning like a fire from the surge of impressions and emotions. It was unthinkable to show up at school like this, and there was no one at home right now. Having decided that she would ask her friend about the questions and answers discussed with the teacher at school, Isabella rushed home and spent almost 2 hours alone admiring her first flowers from a man. Then there were so many more dizzying things to come. Matthew did not like to walk around the city on foot, but he drove her around Miami endless times. His behavior was impeccable, He never allowed anything but a light touch of his lips to hers after a farewell meeting. Even when Isabella was sent from the confectionery factory to a sanatorium on a discounted voucher, Matthew did not ask for a visit. So passed their chaste meetings until Isabella's 18th birthday. After graduating from high school, Isabella was absorbed by the unexpectedly fell on her first love. With the choice of university, she did not particularly wise went to the University of Miami at the Faculty of Philology. She did not like exact sciences very much, but she loved to read books, all in a row. She thought that the profession of a teacher of literature sounds decent and cultural. And the prestige, what about prestige? She didn't want to be an astronaut, or a mall manager, or a TV hostess. She was fine with that. Matthew was a little ironic about her choice, but then he made a joke. Why are you going to teach our children? Writing essays, speaking nicely, and social behavior are already bred, in a sense. When Isabella heard our children, she opened her eyes wide, and then for the first time she couldn't help herself and threw herself around Matthew's neck. Do you understand what you just said? You said I would teach our children. Was that a joke? Tell me, Matthew, you were joking. The man indulgently put his arm around her and stroked her shoulders. He looked into her eyes, and then he kissed her lips with a long kiss. How long had she waited for this moment? How long had she dreamed of her first adult kiss? And yet she wasn't ready for it. The ground fell away from under her feet, the sky fell to the ground, or was it just her imagination? At that moment, Isabella realized that this man was her personal god, her lord, her master. She would follow him into fire and water. Future events were predetermined. Studying at the university, Isabella suddenly came to her liking. The group gathered soulful, as usual at the women's faculty, long heated arguments about the next classic literary masterpiece, seminars in English, where she learned the basics of literacy. Sometimes Matthew would meet her after class and they would go on exciting trips around the state. During the school year, they visited Key West, Sanibel, Mount Dora. One day they wandered around the Everglades all day and then had a picnic with sandwiches right by the lake. Matthew seemed to Isabella a sophisticated aesthete, immersing her in a world of sweet dreams. A man without flaws, a knight from the old books, pleasing his lady in every possible way. Sometimes he suddenly disappeared for a few days and came back happy, said that there was a business trip, all adrenaline. But it only gave him vigor and strength. After the first year, when Isabella's session was over, Matthew took an envelope out of the glove compartment. Baby, I've got a surprise for you. A trip for two to Venice. You wouldn't mind keeping me company in this exquisite land of canals, would you? While Isabella ran to get her passport photo taken, she and Matthew applied for a Schengen visa. He himself had had a multi-visa for a long time. Annie looked disapprovingly at the whole thing. It's no use, Isabella whispered in her mother's ear. I love him to bits. There is no such thing as so much happiness. In Italy, Isabella was immediately dumbfounded by the beauty. She held Matthew's hand like a mesmerized woman and jumped frightened when dark-skinned people tried to sell Isabella souvenirs and some handbags to passers-by. And St. Mark Square, near the Doge's Palace, Matthew and Isabella spent a long time feeding an army of pigeons, having bought a whole bag of grain for €1. The robber birds tried to peck the provisions right from the palms of their hands. Loving couples clung to both of them from all sides, so some tourist immediately began to take pictures of this scene. Matthew booked a hotel near the house of the legendary Casanova. Was this the reason for the uniqueness of their first night, or was it the Venice air? The first time Isabella was with Matthew, she barely remembered the sweetness, the dreams, the fog, the thrill of falling into the abyss while holding hands. By morning, before falling into slumber, she asked, "Why have I never seen any other women around you? You're a wizard." "I was waiting for you, my enchantress," the man replied. Such an inexperienced and trembling girl to lead her down the path to paradise. Isabella remembered the next days in Venice as if in a fog. Coffee and pizza on a cozy summer playground, all on the same Piazza San Marco. Long dinners with a glass of wine. Shopping for gifts for her mother, they bought her a luxurious Venetian mask decorated with bright red and black feathers and the invariable colored stones. Isabella herself was also bought outfits and jewelry. Matthew spared neither money in boutiques nor the energy of tenderness at night in their wonderful room. In terms of procreation, The man was careful to use protection. To the mute question in Isabella's eyes, he remarked weightily, "You will teach our children Russian language and literature later. The main thing now is to get your diploma." Isabella changed her position on the seat in the minibus. There were no more than 50 kilometers to the final destination. The children were peacefully dozing in the back. She could go on rehashing the pages of her sweet life with Matthew, but she remembered something else. The shock she'd experienced when she'd learned that her now husband was a gambler. At Matthew's parents' wedding, in the midst of the raucous party, it seemed to Isabella that everyone kept looking at her strangely. The essence of these looks she realized later, after a frank conversation with her mother-in-law. "You don't know yourself, child. What kind of story our Matthew has gotten into with this unearthly love of yours? He's sick. A mad gambler. Like every gambler, he's had his downs and ups. Big winnings alternated with temporary cash fiascos. In parallel, he began studying at the Law Academy, which, contrary to his passion, graduated with a red diploma. Neither the heat of his addiction cooled down, nor did the career that began later, quite successful for a young specialist." Annie breathed a sigh of relief. "And only after he met you. They could not believe their eyes you were able to conquer the heart of our impregnable fortress in male form. In 1929, when all such establishments were noisily shut down, Matthew seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. And then he began to go on imaginary business trips to those unfortunate zones in Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and Monaco. He flew there infrequently, came back inspired, but he was increasingly unlucky. One day, my husband Christian discovered that expensive things were disappearing from the house. I was missing some diamond and emerald jewelry from my jewelry box. Christian's conversation with Matthew was stern. His father gave him an ultimatum: either he ends his gambling dalliances or moves out of the house. That's when Matthew announced to us that he was getting married immediately and would live with his wife. Isabella could not believe her ears. All this story, told by the new mother-in-law, could not be true. There was no way her idol, her husband, her Matthew, could be a gambler. They'd been together for years. Except for the occasional business trips, from which he returned enthusiastic, there was no hint of this madness in him. After the wedding, the newlyweds did live with the bride's mother. Matthew didn't say a peep about the conditions, the modest, poor surroundings of the new house. If personal belongings were needed, he'd go to his parents' house and haul huge bags of groceries, delicacies, and high-end drinks. He and Isabella slept in a small bedroom, the former den of the Three Bears, which was now occupied by a huge marital bed. Isabella still forgot everything as soon as her husband closed the door to their bedroom. 6 months later, she realized she was expecting a child, and when the doctor announced at the ultrasound that there would be twins, she was terribly surprised. "My God, Matthew, where did this miracle come from?" Her husband smiled reassuringly at her. "So I have a twin mother. It's a genetic thing. Now we've been blessed with this good fortune." Isabella and Jasper felt a little uncomfortable in the orphanage manager's office. Half an hour ago, they had told the director what they wanted to do. "I can't deny that you surprised me," she replied. "Children with complicated backgrounds and problems are usually rejected by prospective adoptive parents right away. Everyone wants that, if they have already decided to take such an extraordinary step. Their future children would be without flaws." She went into the archive for a long time with the cases of wards, and then brought them 5 folders. "These are my most deprived, most difficult cases. Familiarize yourself with their stories. I'll come out and give you time to make a decision." Isabella resolutely reached into the top folder, opened the cover. From the first page, the serious eyes of a boy of about 10 looked up at her. Even in the photo, there was such bitterness in them that she felt uneasy. The name was Kirill. He had been living in the orphanage for 3 years. His parents were killed in a car accident, and he himself was thrown under the wheels of the truck responsible for the tragedy. His leg just below the knee had to be amputated. There is no doubt that the boy is well adapted to the prosthesis, serves himself independently. The characterization said withdrawn, poorly socialized, sometimes aggressive. Jasper, to whom she was reading all this aloud, felt a chill run down his spine at his own memories. He glanced at Isabella, but she smiled warmly back, understanding without words. She already knew the story of his injury. So here's the first candidate to join us. Are you in? Isabella asked. I'm in. I thought you'd be embarrassed by his injury. Not at all. I'm sure we can effect a change in his character and disposition. The children will understand our choice too. I don't doubt that, Jasper said. Isabella pulled the next folder from the bottom for some reason and untied the straps. This time it was the file of a girl named Catherine. From the photograph, she was staring at her with attentive eyes, magnified by some kind of peculiar glasses. Age 7 years. In need of serious ophthalmologic surgery. Waiting for a quota for a place in an eye clinic. Straight A student. She's into drawing, plasticine, molding, burning. What do you think? Jasper said questioningly. The twins had just taken all the supplies of blank sketchbooks, plasticine, and paints up to the attic. We'll have to climb up and bring it all back, Isabella summarized bluntly. Now 2 folders were put aside, but the potential owners of the future family orphanage did not think to stop there. The next folder immediately elicited smiles. In it lay the file of one of the 2 twin brothers, and next to it the biography of the second. However, they had them as if they were copied. The trouble with these 2 boys was that although they had been orphaned a long time ago, no one of the adopters dared to take in a family of 2, prone to petty hooliganism in their 10 years. Our girls and boys will be happy. Let's fulfill their wish, Isabella decided at once. Yes, Comrade Commander. Jasper sang along. There was one more folder on the edge of the table. It contained the file of 5-year-old Lucy. The girl had a disease rumored to affect the greats of this world: Socrates, Newton, Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky, Pythagoras and Nobel. Lucy's extraordinary abilities had already been noticed: phenomenal memory, the ability at her age to quickly add up 2-digit numbers. The name of the disease is epilepsy. At the time of the Roman Emperor Caesar, who also suffered from this disease, it was also called the carrion disease. Treatment was only needed to correct it. Jasper and Isabella looked at each other and said nothing. The folder moved smoothly to the others. At the same time, his mistress entered the office. Here is the corrected text, taking into account your requirements. The children will also understand us in this choice. I don't doubt that, Jasper said. For some reason, Isabella pulled the next folder from the bottom and untied the straps. This time it was the file of a girl named Catherine. From the photograph, she was staring at her with attentive eyes, magnified by some kind of peculiar glasses. Age 7 years. In need of serious ophthalmologic surgery. Waiting for a quota for a place in an eye clinic. Straight A student. She's into drawing, plasticine, molding, burning. What do you think? Jasper said questioningly. The twins had just taken all the supplies of blank sketchbooks, plasticine and paints up to the attic. We'll have to climb up and bring it all back, Isabella summarized bluntly. Now 2 folders were put aside, but the potential owners of the future family orphanage did not think to stop there. The next folder immediately elicited smiles. In it lay the file of one of the 2 twin brothers, and next to it the biography of the second. However, they had them as if they were copied. The trouble with these 2 boys was that, although they had been orphaned a long time ago, no one of the adopters dared to take in a family of 2, prone to petty hooliganism in their 10 years. Our girls and boys will be happy. Let's fulfill their wish, Isabella decided at once. Yes, Comrade Commander. Jasper sang along. There was one more folder on the edge of the table. It contained the file of 5-year-old Lucy. The girl had a disease rumored to affect the greats of this world: Socrates, Newton, Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky, Pythagoras and Nobel. Lucy's extraordinary abilities had already been noticed: phenomenal memory, the ability at her age to quickly add up 2-digit numbers. The name of the disease is epilepsy. At the time of the Roman Emperor Caesar, who also suffered from this disease, it was also called the carrion disease. Treatment was only needed to correct it. Jasper and Isabella looked at each other and said nothing. The folder moved smoothly to the others. At the same time, his mistress entered the office. Having looked at the folders, the director said, I told you that it is better to choose a child not from this list. These all get rejected at once. Why go to such trouble when there are many other offers? You misunderstand, U.S. Jasper replied. We want to adopt all these kids, take them to our family orphanage in Riverside. There is a middle school and a kindergarten there. What paperwork do we need to gather to finalize all the formalities sooner? The principal, stunned, fell silent, and when she was able to speak again, tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. You guys are amazing. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, who would have believed it? You are making a difference in these kids' lives. Riverside is bustling with activity. Around Jasper's tall figure, the boys are busy building their own wood-fired bathhouse. Jasper has promised that everyone will be assigned their own work. Matthew is appointed foreman. His task is to distribute building materials, distribute tools to the kids, keep records of logs, nails, and other small things. The boy's pride is so great that he has almost stopped limping. The other 4 twins are exhausted that the process is not started. Especially Jasper promised to take everyone to the river in the evening. Under the apple tree, Stacy sits on the swing. She recently had eye surgery and her face is still in bandages. But they say that when the bandages come off, she'll have almost 100% vision. Amelie, Megan, and Annie are helping their mom, Isabella. They decided to bake pies with different fillings, cabbage, mushrooms, and apples, which the boys picked from an old tree in the morning. Isabella has had a hard time managing the house alone lately. By the end of the fall, they were expecting a new addition to their family. Jasper would become a father for the 10th time, and Isabella would become a mother, of course. On the thick branches of the apple tree, camouflaged by green leaves due to the coloring, sit chicks. The oriole watched the people and thought these people have everything like us, a big nest. There is a mother preparing food for her chicks. Good attracts good. Even a small oriole knows this law. She wasn't going to teach anyone. The bird reasoned. That's why everything in their house is fine and good. The oriole looked back at her hungry chicks in the nest. And I have to go to my babies. I have a lot of things to do. I've already been here for a long time, admiring this family idyll. Having made the last circle over the apple tree, she soared into the sky, rejoicing that there are such wonderful people in the world, living by the laws of kindness and care, like birds, of greens thoughtfully all evening. She reasoned that fatty meats and cheeseburgers were a disaster for a dancer, and she would refrain from grape wine. There are so many calories in it. I ironically looked at the large portions of dishes that Jasper ordered for himself. He sighed furtively. All right, I guess it's all right for you as a man. I'll abstain. At night, Stacy was not exactly cold, but somehow indifferent, like an inevitable job. She didn't wrinkle her nose, but she didn't enjoy it. Jasper was confused, thinking frantically, we've known each other for so long. And I've been such a blind, stupid, lovesick ass. I don't know this seemingly lovely woman who is now sitting across from me at a table in a restaurant. The 2 weeks which were to be the crowning of their long romance for Jasper dragged on with unexpected agony. They came home, not in a quarrel, but in a strained relationship. It was as if a cat had run between them. To all her oddities, characteristic of many women, Stacy was not at all adapted to household chores. The only things she could manage were the coffee she brought to Jasper's house from her own supplies, scrambled eggs and fried potatoes. But she had them burned to black coals. The soups were liquid and tasteless. The sink was perpetually filled with unwashed dishes. Jasper's closet was scary to look at after laundry. Seeing all these domestic metamorphoses, Jasper clutched his head. Stacy, don't make us anything for dinner. I'll come home from work and do it myself, Jasper said. Stacy was glad that her husband had decided to do this. She flew back from the School of Culture satisfied, filled with news about performances and premieres. Was her husband hungry after a hard shift? She did not care at all. At this time in the life of Jasper began to change. An old battle buddy of their coach came to the wushu class. They whispered about something in the locker room for a long time, and then Jasper and 3 other boys were invited into the office. The guest once again scrutinized all 4 of them, and then offered them to study at the academy, not forgetting to mention that it was definitely voluntary. We are looking for young cadres with perfect physical fitness. The training will last 5 years. You will have to study in New York, he said. The words of the army friend and their trainer were immediately imprinted in Jasper's mind as if they had been hammered in with a sledgehammer. He knew at once that he wanted to study at the place he'd been offered, even if he had to divorce Stacy. The most interesting part of his love story was that his wife didn't even seem to understand what her spouse was trying to tell her. She silently listened to his desire to go to New York, to the academy. Shook her head with smooth blonde curls, waved her eyelashes, and rushed away to measure a suit for some regular premiere. They divorced in absentia when he was already 3 months in New York, because he did not want to get old. His parents were still traveling across America on motorcycles, and his ex-wife was learning another PA's. Amidst all these events, Jasper was learning the science of being brave, ruthless to his enemies, steely as the strongest metal or alloy. After graduating from the academy, he was assigned to the Caucasus, and together with a mysterious friend Greg, who was a completely reckless guy. His superiors had no time to give him a command, and he was already in the thick of it. Nothing would take him. And in Besiege, he died dragging 2 guys out of a burned-out gymnasium. Jasper rushed to him, grabbed the girl and the boy, and carried them to the exit. Here's the rest of the edited text. Jasper was wounded when he had already moved a few meters away from where his comrade had died. He couldn't stop and close his eyes either, so his friend's frozen stare at the ceiling in the corridor of the besieged school sometimes haunted him in the dead of night when he couldn't sleep. Jasper had been wounded in the kneecap. The leg had failed him. He only shrieked slightly before he sat down gently on the floor and cradled the frightened little ones against him. Someone's hands picked the school children up off the floor again like a button. Or maybe it was the blood on the floor and walls that made everything seem bright purple to him. Jasper shook his head unhappily and thought, what the hell is this? I've only spent an hour with the new residents of Berrywood, and already so many scraps of memory from the nooks and crannies. He really didn't like to remember those tragic days. The eyes of those who searched in the general chaos for their loved ones. The medical staff at the hospital, where at first the surgeon had categorically stated that his wound was quite unfortunate. He vaguely remembered those medical terms and verbose arguments escalapa. Remembered the verdict of the old man: the leg would be better to amputate above the knee. Inflammation will go to the thigh. We'll have to cut further. He was extremely lucky that then in the operating room came an elderly woman doctor with a long experience of working with wounded soldiers. I'll take him. We're not going to do any amputations. First, I will do what I think is necessary, and time will show which of us will be right, she said. More than 10 years had passed since then. Jasper was discharged after his injury. His leg still gave him a stubbornly persistent pain. He was even given a disability group without question. He taught for a while, but he couldn't stand in the classroom for long. His restless parents died on their old motorcycle 3 years ago. They decided to shake old times at a gathering of veteran bikers. The track was wet after a rainstorm, and they didn't make it into a tight turn. They left on the same day. The mother right at the scene of the accident, the father 2 hours later in the hospital. His parents' injuries were incompatible with life, but Jasper knew that his ancestors wouldn't have wanted a better death for themselves together, side by side, in the arms of their iron horses. Jasper didn't want to stay in his hometown any longer, so he moved closer to London, where many of his fellow servicemen had settled. In the village of Little Wilmington, he had a good life. He received a decent government paycheck. He was also surrounded by many lonely elderly women, who always invited him to help out on their allotments. They paid him with natural products: fresh eggs straight from under the laying hens, dairy products from cows, homemade pies of their own baking. So he lived well, but only at the sight of children he became sad. He didn't want to have children of his own. And now, apparently it was too late. Isabella and the twins settled into their new home in Berrywood surprisingly quickly. It was as if they'd lived there for 100 years. At first, the woman could not understand how it happened. She was not the one who built the house. And yet she felt as if she knew every centimeter of the house. A chatty neighbor told her that this house belonged to very unpleasant people, as she put it, intellectuals to the bone, descendants of some Russian aristocrats. But the former owners did not talk much about their past. They spent a quiet old age in this dwelling, and then, when their strength was no longer the same, they moved to the city, closer to their children. A neighbor said that their ancestors had lived there before, but she had no information about that. Isabella's family moved to Berrywood at the beginning of the summer, as soon as the household was in relative order. The woman immediately went to the local school and kindergarten, but she was disappointed there were no vacancies for her teaching profession. There was not enough work for the villagers themselves, who were mostly surviving on subsistence farming. After some thought, Isabella decided to follow their example. The same neighbor presented her with a mini chicken with ears, and she refused to take money for the bird. "Did you buy it? We'll get even somehow else in this world," she grumpily waved away. "So if I run out of salt and sugar, you won't give me a little of it from your stock?" grumbled the neighbor. "Come on. I'll show you how to organize the henhouse better." Isabella had a strange relationship with Jasper. The woman felt that he was happy to be in their house to play with the twins. The twins themselves reciprocated with joy. First, they had patched the porch together after Amelie, the Skid Row enthusiast, had hurt her foot somewhere. Then they did something together on the roof. Isabella at first tried to keep the whole group off the roof, but Jasper said, "Their safety is my responsibility." And somehow she was at ease, trusting him. After the noisy chores, they went to the river. Jasper showed them where among the reeds there was the most convenient entrance to the water on the soft silk bank. After bathing, Isabella sat on the bank and admired how deftly Jasper swam far from the shore, leaving behind him an even line of small waves formed by the strokes of his strong, naked arms. She was for the first time surprisingly calm around this somewhat sullen, unspoken man. Sometimes she listened involuntarily to his conversations with the children. Without a shadow of irony, he taught them the proper way to stay on the water or wield a hammer. He smilingly instructed the girls on the best way to approach a chicken to get fresh eggs for breakfast. The pinnacle of their enthusiasm was a hike into the woods to get their first strawberries. Jasper showed them such a generous glade with scatterings of sweet, juice-filled berries that they were silent for a long time, only clapping the strawberries. An outing for mushrooms also became a discovery. Closer to August, there were so many mushrooms under snags and fallen leaves that the twins and Isabella, who were not used to such luxury, had their eyes wide open. Everything flew into the mushroom pouch. Jasper grinned, sat them all down on a thick log, and taught them. He laid them out on a light-colored plaid spread on the ground. He familiarized all the prey with each species, mercilessly dividing the children's prey into edible and inedible parts. In the evening, all together fried the mushrooms in a huge frying pan. Then they waited for them, poured with homemade sour cream, to acquire that unique flavor, which is inherent only in forest meadows. Jasper looked at the stove and said to Isabella, "Let me restore the old lady a little. I haven't noticed how fall has arrived. We need to get her cleaned up so we don't have any problems with her. I'd love to do a little renovation myself. I don't understand anything about its structure, but I've learned how to heat it and cook. The rest is a dark forest for me," Isabella answered readily. They decided to fix the stove tomorrow. Today, Isabella would cook something hot enough to last a couple of days. We scattered the things around the nurse. Jasper came in early for the morning. He hadn't been at home lately when it came to seeing Isabella and her children. He'd been running around like he was on a date. He tempered his ardor, and then admitted to himself the very thing that you, for the first time in so many years, you feel good, warm and cozy next to a woman. When was the last time you paid attention to the female sex? You probably can't remember. Isabella and the boys' house was all ready for the important process of renewing the stove. Jasper brought Believa tools to clean the chimney. The work went on briskly. Tom, Tobias, Maggie, and Megan were pouring out with joyful laughter every time the soot-stained face of the foreman turned toward their friendly foursome. Having finished inspecting the interior, they set about decorating the exterior. Jasper looked closely at the almost flat surface of the stove barrel, and his gaze caught on some protrusion, barely visible to the naked eye. "What the hell is that?" he wondered aloud. Isabella came closer, and while Jasper went to wash up, she cleaned off the bump with a kitchen knife. The stove was going to be plastered over now anyway, to smooth out the unevenness. Instantly, a handful of old plaster spilled onto the floor, and a small hole opened up. Curiosity took over. Isabella began to excavate the hole, rotating the knife clockwise. A couple minutes later, Jasper came back into the room. "What is this?" The man was surprised to see a whole empty cavity in the stove behind the shining masonry. There should never have been any such holes in a Russian stove. In the meantime, Isabella slipped her hand into the opening and found something cold and dusty, covered with a layer of mossy growth. She picked up something small and round with her fingers and pulled out a dull yellow round thing. On first inspection, it was clear that it was an ancient coin. The woman put her hand back into the furnace lair and determined by touch that there were many such round coins behind the supposed brickwork inside. Jasper, meanwhile, was already scrubbing the first trophy from the dirt. "I'm no good at this," he whistled, though we had a class at the academy on precious metals and other valuable objects. "Your find seems to be a gold coin of the Tsiar's minting." At the General Family Council, it was decided to dismantle the masonry and see what other surprises it hides behind it. It was said done. The stash in the stove gave them 67 coins. Even through the dust of time, they were of different denominations. Jasper secretly watched to see how the lady of the house would react to the unexpected treasure. Isabella was perfectly calm, marveling with everyone else at every coin that had been removed. No greedy gleam appeared in her eyes. Not even thoughtfulness was written on her face. Jasper remembered a story about another small treasure. Once, while still in the Caucasus, they had found a pot with a few gold coins in it. One of the locals quickly prepared a soap solution and told everyone to be patient. The next day, the coins in that pot shone in the sun like new. After ordering the children to fetch a basin from the corridor, Jasper began to work on the stove, removing all the old bars of bricks, cleaning them of clumps, checking the inside again, and bricking up the hole. The former site of the treasure. Isabella at this time washed us, scolded us, put the coins on the white bottom of the dish, poured it all with warm water from the kettle. She did not even think about what to do with the acquisition. Jasper's question distracted her from her chores. "What will you do, madam, with the inheritance from the past?" She did not hesitate a moment. "I'll take 7 coins, and the rest will give to the state." The man thought to himself that he would do the same. He and Isabella looked at the wonders of the world with the same eyes. An epiphany flashed through his mind. He realized who Isabella reminded him of all the time. The comparison was strange. It seemed to him like the beautiful oriole bird he had so often met in the woods. The caring mother oriole always hovered around her nest, which looked like a small wicker basket, and tended to her chicks, eagerly opening their beaks in anticipation of food. It was a golden nest, and Jasper suddenly thought that the other woman would have stashed the coins away and taken them out one by one from time to time. But this woman had thought that she would not eat of other people's goods. She decided to give her find to the authorities without complaint. That's odd. The whole company spent the rest of the evening working with the coins with enthusiasm. Jasper finished the job with a match. The children watched the process of washing the coins in the basin. The profile of Emperor Nicholas II was already clearly visible there. On other coins, the double-headed eagle, the emblem of the great Russian Empire, peeped through, creating the illusion that in the basin there was some sacrament of cleansing the coins from centuries of sins. No one knew. Maybe this treasure is some mysterious family legend. By late afternoon, everyone was exhausted. Isabella heated up the nourishing dishes she had prepared beforehand. At dinner, everyone was tiredly silent, even the twins who never stopped talking. After the meal, the children sleepily drifted off to their bedrooms. Isabella went to see Jasper off. Then the unexpected happened. She suddenly put her arm around his shoulders from behind and asked, "Will you stay?" Jasper staggered back in surprise. At that moment, he realized a truth he had been shamefully hiding even from himself. He wanted this woman very much to be near him. From the first moment he'd seen her in the van and held her gaze for a long moment. Jasper turned around swiftly. Despite his injury, he felt a rush of energy, as if he'd drunk a magic elixir filled with adrenaline. He picked Isabella up in his arms as if in a fog and carried her to the bed. There had never been another man in Isabella's life but Artem. In Jasper's fate, there was Nastia and a string of casual one-night stands whose names he sometimes didn't even know or couldn't remember. In rare moments of rest, Jasper could vaguely think, I haven't had all those women in my life that I've known before. They may not be worth a fingernail on the little finger of the one who is now serenely embracing me. Isabella's thoughts flowed smoothly in the same direction. Did you think that your husband, who has caused you so much trouble, was the end of the world? Holy naivete. A man like Jasper is a man you should cling to and never let go of. Before dawn, Jasper whispered in Isabella's ear that it was time for him to go, but not because he wanted to. He would stay by her side forever. He had a lingering feeling that they were together now, that Isabella thought so too, that they would share all the chores equally. 2 days later, they had thoroughly laundered all 67 gold coins. Jasper and Isabella took them to the local police station. They were now only doing everything together, just as Jasper had envisioned. And it felt so natural, as if they had been living as a family for a long time. Before the process of transferring the treasure to the state, Jasper read the internet, how according to the law all the correct formalization, prepared a photo of the oven, located in the surprise, took pictures of the coins, laid out in even rows on the kitchen table. Except that the testimony of witnesses to the discovery of the treasure could not be formalized. All four twins were still minors and incapacitated. In the police, the whole department gathered to gaze at the miracle. The act of handing over the coins was drawn up without delay. Isabella was informed that after the evaluation of the found by experts, she will be paid a sum of money in the amount of 50% of the income received by the Treasury. According to the most modest calculations, the amount of remuneration was solid. On the way back from the district center, Jasper and Isabella were silent. Each was thinking about something else. They spoke at the same time, as if they had both made the only right decision. "I want to take the children from the orphanage," the woman began. "I want to be with you and your twins, and all the children will have," Jasper replied. Isabella had brought up the orphanage for a reason. At the end of the summer, they'd gone to the nearest town to buy backpacks and stationery. Maria and Veronica were going to first grade for the first time this year, and the more experienced boys were going to third grade. A small bus stopped near the stationery store. There were a lot of children of different ages, and there were only 2 chaperones. Irie immediately realized the boys from the orphanage were brought for notebooks and pens. She would have immediately forgotten this meeting, but she was pinned to the floor by the gaze of one boy. He looked at her children and at herself, hugging them by the shoulders. So many unfulfilled dreams of her own family, her parents, and a deep longing were in his gaze that Isabella was embarrassed and quickly led her school children away to another store. Jasper and Isabella returned to their conversation about starting a family orphanage after she received the money she was owed for finding the treasure. There was no doubt about spending the windfall to build a luxury mansion for themselves. On the contrary, they gathered a general family meeting in the presence of the twins, who happily accepted the fact that Jasper and their mother were now together, without asking too many questions. The agenda was, would everyone be willing to vote to make their family even bigger? Suggestions came in a variety of ways. "Let's look for twins at the orphanage," 2 Maggie suggested. "We'll only take boys," said Emmett and Tobias. "Guys, why don't we not make the rules beforehand?" "Your heart will tell you," Isabella asked. "I have an idea," Jasper said, embarrassed. "We need to find out in our neighborhood children's institution which of the children there is the most difficult." For the first time after the birth of Tom and Tobias, he was the most caring and attentive father. He shared the household chores with her equally, even learned to wash dishes and cook porridge. A year later, Isabella felt uneasy again. She felt sleepy in the evenings. The smell of fried fish made Isabella dizzy. The doctor's verdict: "You're pregnant again." She and Matthew greeted the news with enthusiasm. By then, Matthew's parents had gone abroad on a diplomatic contract. They would not be crowded now. The family decided to move into his parents' apartment next door. Moreover, Amelie had not been feeling well lately. Christian was getting tired of taking care of his grandchildren. He was sneaking pills while the children were out of sight. The power of Matthew's mother's genes was very strong. In due time in the family appeared another twins, this time girls Maggie and Megan. To give credit to Mother Nature, she did not rest on the children of Matthew and Isabella. The kids managed to take from their parents all the most beautiful features. The brothers had blue eyes and black hair like their mother. The sisters had huge eyes the color of milk chocolate and golden curls. Their figures were 1-to-1, modest from their early childhood. Age's sores never clung to this quartet. Their disposition was good-natured, their character mischievous, fond of mischief and invention. But all 4 were not capricious but genetic. Isabella's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden braking of the bus. "I'm sorry, I almost missed the address you gave me," the little driver apologized. But there was no reason to scold him for it. Redwood Village. All the houses stood far apart, like people sometimes showing urban loneliness. Some man walked past their van, limping, casting a hard, scrutinizing glance at their expedition. "This place isn't friendly," Isabella thought. "I have found the local controller, The things were quickly transferred to the new dwelling, and the children went to inspect the house. Isabella suddenly felt intolerably hungry. She frantically searched through her bags for a bag of bagels while she gnawed on the bread gut. There was a knock at the door just as the bagel was in her mouth. Isabella went to open the door to the uninvited guests. The same limping man stood on the doorstep, holding a basket. There was a knock on the door and Isabella opened it. On the threshold stood the limping man with the basket. "Good evening, my hosts. My name is Jasper. I'm the village chief," he introduced himself. "You can get the documents for the house with all the seals tomorrow at the village administration. In the meantime, I have brought you milk, sour cream, eggs, fresh bread from our bakery. The store is closed today. You'll need all this from the road. You have children with you." Isabella was a little taken aback. She didn't know anyone at her new place of residence, and here she was welcomed. She accepted the basket of supplies from Jasper's hands. She had so hastily and nervously packed the apartment that they had no supplies except a few bagels and half a jar of frozen apricot jam. Going into the house, Jasper refused. He turned around a little awkwardly on the porch and said one last thing. "The stove in the house is working. I've been checking, and it'll make eggs or scrambled eggs for the boys too." Isabella turned around helplessly from which side to approach the Russian stove. She had no idea. Jasper understood without words. "What's your name, mistress?" "Isabella," the woman answered. "Don't worry, Isabella. I'll show you how to use this machine. It's not difficult." Half an hour later, the stove was crackling cozily with dry wood, which Jasper had cleverly arranged in an intricate arrangement. Eggs were smoldering on the table, and the 4 young robbers were already spreading sour cream on the bread, drinking warm, steaming milk from mugs Isabella had found in a nearby box. After a hearty supper, the children piled into the far room, where the beds were wide. The woman laid out the bedclothes on the run. She didn't even have time to notice where her assistant had gone. Isabella herself got the bed. It was surprisingly wide and comfortable. When she lay down, she thought she would fall asleep with her head barely touching the pillow. But insidious memories crowded her again. Matthew bored abruptly at half a word, averting his eyes to the side, said, "I have a business trip to Miami, where they are opening a new facility in the village." Isabella, of course, had no idea about her husband's new addiction. Previously, he was only slumbering passion for gambling, but now it flared up, drawing him to the gambling tables of the casino. On a business trip to San Diego, Matthew was in San Diego for a week. He came back elated. He flew in, bought Isabella and the kids presents, said that he received a bonus for successful work, and it did not occur to her that her husband brazenly lied, spending another big winnings. This trip was followed by a series of other trips. Matthew invariably returned glum and gloomy, but Isabella never thought that her luck had turned away from her husband. It came as a thunderclap when it was discovered that Amelie had cancer. The operation was taken to do in Germany, but the German doctors asked for an unaffordable price. Isabella didn't have that kind of money. Matthew refused to help. There were no new orders from clients at work. Where am I going to get that kind of money? Amelie's grip on the disease was deadly. The woman was weakening before her eyes. Isabella tossed between 2 houses and then could not stand it, asked her mother-in-law for money. They did not refuse. Satisfied with the result of negotiations, she flew to tell Matthew the news. His reaction was strange. "Where did you get this money from? My baby, my girl, my goddess. I'll withdraw the whole amount from the bank myself. Don't ask your parents, you'll find out what a clever girl you are. My treasure, my reward." As luck would have it, all the twins got a viral infection at the same time. They were feverish, cranky, coughing, and snotty. Isabella got all the information from her mother-in-law about the money transfer and sent her husband to the bank. He disappeared for 2 days. He returned home gloomy. He announced on the doorstep, "Isabella, I've been framed. Now I owe serious people a lot of money. I'm leaving New York for a while and I won't even tell you where." Things have gone too far. Matthew couldn't hide from the criminal creditors. A week later, operatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at his parents' apartment. Isabella was invited to identify the body of an unknown man found in the Hudson River. She walked to the morgue as if she were going to an execution, on wobbly legs. A creepy institution with blue, purple, neon lights, rows of shiny metal tables everywhere, on one of which Matthew lay. She recognized him at once. Her heart felt like it had plummeted into an abyss. Beautiful brown eyes were closed. The mole on his neck that she loved so much caught her eye. "Why should I suffer this agony?" her soul screamed. "My beloved, my best, my only, my kin." There were no tears for some reason. It seemed as if everything inside had turned into an icy stone. It wouldn't melt, wouldn't budge. Isabella Machine signed all the necessary papers, dryly asked when her husband's body could be buried. "The investigation is underway. We'll let you know later when the burial can take place." This nightmarish day did not end with the terrible news of her husband's death. Isabella first called Matthew's parents to tell them the tragic news. The father-in-law, even at such a sorrowful moment, could not escape from distant wanderings to his homeland. Matthew's mother could not even speak from grief. She refused to fly over, saying, "I want to remember my boy alive. You there yourself take care of a decent send-off." The end of the chain of fateful events was a sharp deterioration of Amélie's condition. Isabella did not dare to ask her mother-in-law for money again. Mother was put in the hospital. Now she existed only on painkillers. There were many people at Matthew's cremation. Isabella only knew a few of his co-workers. There were 100 of them here. The faces were mostly unfamiliar to her. A close friend of her husband's helped with the funeral. Not so much a friend as a partner in the law business. No matter how she looked at it, her Matthew wasn't the most distinguished professional. Many appropriate speeches were made, and Isabella kept thinking about what the investigator had asked her. Did he have any enemies? She did not know the answer, but she was sure that her husband's death was connected with his addiction to gambling. Isabella did not even ask herself where the large sum of money sent by her husband's parents had gone. Amélie had not lasted long after Matthew's death. With 4 children in her arms, Isabella had no way to get her mother to foreign clinics. And the doctors said the time was irretrievably lost. So Isabella took Amélie's mind back home. Mom had changed a lot, turned into a sickly, lightweight, like a tiny Thumbelina. She had hardly eaten anything for a long time. So a couple of spoonfuls of liquid broth inside her, all organs were affected by a malignant tumor. Every movement was a feat for Amélie. The disease she could not overcome. Even before that, Isabella moved back in with her mother. The huge apartment without Matthew seemed to her like a gloomy crypt. Everything reminded her of him. It was unbearable. After the departure of 2 people very close to her, she lived for a while as if in a vacuum, with the children and the house like a robot. It turned out that Matthew still maintained the family quite well. Because Isabella never became a teacher of Russian language and literature, she was a housewife. Somehow their previous environment became completely unbearable. The walls in the apartment she had once loved pressed on her, and the ceiling seemed low. In the kitchen, the old tulle curtains and curtains with flowers irritated her. She wanted to rip them down and stomp on them. Isabella realized one day that if she didn't move out of this place, her life would remain dull and hopeless. The apartment, though on the outskirts of New York, which had almost become a neighborhood close to the center, cost a lot of money. Isabella had no savings, no inheritance from rich relatives. The decision to sell everything and find a place to live somewhere within 300 kilometers of the city matured rapidly. House in the village. Birchwood realtor, looking for a buyer for her apartment, found quickly. She refused to even go to see it. For some reason, she believed the pictures right away. She was attracted by a rivulet flowing half a kilometer from the future shelter. Isabella liked the pretty forest and the smooth rows of birch trees on its outskirts. The paperwork was done in a matter of days, and there were no delays anywhere. Isabella estimated that the proceeds would be enough for her and her children for the first time, and then she would look for a job as a teacher in the local school, or a kindergarten teacher. Communicating with her sons and daughters revealed to her the truth. She loves the kids very sincerely, truly. She is interested in the older kids. If Matthew were alive, she'd have twins and she wouldn't hesitate for a second. Isabella smiled. It brought to mind an incident in Emmett's life, who didn't miss a single living thing in the yard, from the big dogs to the brightly colored ants that lined the path from the manhole to the bushes. The janitor's vain attempts to disperse the industrious insects provoked fierce resistance from Emmett. He made bridges out of cardboard to cover the ant kingdom so no one could step on it. So Isabella aided every stray lesser brother in the neighborhood and offered to pick them up for the neighbors. And then drove Isabella and Matthew to hysterics in general. He walked into their room with a serious look on his face and asked, "Dad, Mom, don't swear, but I have a big favor to ask of you. Please give birth to a kitten from the street. You don't allow me pets. But if you're his parents, he'll be my brother, and you won't kick him out then." Matthew almost fell off the bed at such a suggestion, and Isabella, combing Tobias's curls after bathing, dropped the comb. A serious task must be answered accordingly. So the puzzled mother advised Emmett to go to their neighbor on the landing, Nellie, in the apartment across the hall. She had a gorgeous Siberian cat named Grinny for some reason. Isabella assured Emmett that Grinny's cat could be useful to him in giving birth to a kitten. Nellie worked in the trauma room of the district hospital and part-time treated all the injuries of the children in their yard. Nellie opened the door to Emmett, who had come on an important mission. Then she discussed something with him for a long time. Emmett returned home with 4 small chocolates for all his siblings and the overwhelming news. "Granny can't give birth to a kitten for me because he's a man. We men can't give birth. Also, there was a surgical invasion of his privacy, so he can't be a father to my kitten." After giving out this information, Emmett even sweated from the exertion. But he never asked Isabella and Matthew to give birth to a kitten again. It was too complicated for his notion. Isabella also thought of a funny story about her girl neighbors. That year, the playground was being renovated. The wooden slide was covered in brush. Workers had not yet had time to put a metal flat surface underneath. But had that ever stopped anyone? Maggie and Megan rolled dashingly down the rough surface, despite the danger. Megan was lucky. Maggie immediately caught a huge brush right in her soft spot. Whole delegations came to nail a crying Maggie, Isabella, and a terrified Megan in the tail. The operation lasted 2 minutes. When a sliver at least 3 centimeters long was extracted from Maggie's 5th point, Megan finally exhaled. "Mom, Aunt Nellie. Now I know what the very thing looks like." The trauma neighbor and Isabella lay on the floor, laughing. They didn't have the energy to talk. Yes, there had been many good things in her life. It was only the last 2 years that had been incredibly difficult and tragic. Things were going to get better now. Jasper walked toward his house, where the cat scratching at his heart. Being in the company of 4 boys who were so vigorous at once made him sad. The healthy shoulders of an experienced, outwardly stern and unapproachable man with kind, pure eyes would never admit to anyone that he loved children. Except that he himself to become a father by the age of 40 years with a tail never happened. Everything in this life was connected with children, remained for Jasper tragic and painful. After 2004, when Jasper together with the guys from his unit freed people in the Beastland tragedy, he came to North Ossetia by chance together with his friend Tobias, with whom he had already participated in more than one operation side by side and studied together at the Academy of Civil Service, where he was in the epicenter of the struggle for justice and a bright future. Jasper had dreamed of this since he was young, even as a child. His parents were desperate people, bikers, obsessed with motorcycles, which at that time in the USSR were not easy to get. His father was fond of heavy rock, even named his son in honor of the first letters of the Scottish rock band. He strokes the side of his iron friend, puts on a protective helmet, turns on the music, sits behind the faithful companion, and rushes through the cities and towns of a huge country. Life is not adjusted. No big deal. After Jasper was born, his mother had to settle in one of the small southern towns. They rented a house by the sea. The head of the family was only in and out of town. The winds of wanderlust overcame his thoughts of responsibility for his family. All his visits, however, he devoted exclusively to his son. Jasper grew up surrounded by steppe diversity to the sound of sea waves. Already in kindergarten, he could fight back any older bully if he hurt him. At the age of 6, he joined a wushu class. The coach, paying attention to the bully boy, always defending all the weak in the group, brought him into the section. Even at all children's matines, Jasper always got the role of bogatars and brave astronauts. In the section, from a small age, he became his own. He quickly became respected even by the older kids. The level of skill in the martial art of wushu, to which Jasper now devoted all his free time, he reached quickly. Then over the years, only the colors of belts changed. Competitions were held. in which he often came out victorious and his skills improved. At the age of 15, the guy could already fully serve himself. At home, he cooked perfectly, kept himself and the whole house clean. Visiting occasionally, parents only marveled. The house was in perfect order. The diary is full of good and excellent grades, and even in the refrigerator, fresh soup and cutlets and porridge. Not a guy growing up, but an enviable groom. Girls began to look at the charismatic, charming Jasper already in middle school. His appearance is remarkable. The young man, as if sculpted, nature has worked to give glamour to his manly appearance. A torso, thick hair, and steely gray eyes to keep the image from being too harsh. Mother Nature finished with a smile and rewarded Jasper's face with mischievous dimples. It seemed that with such a guy, as behind a stone wall, all the girls in the village. And they weren't wrong. At 16, Jasper fell in love. He had the misfortune to choose the wrong one. He fell in love with a girl who practiced choreography in the same club as his wushu section. This creature was sophisticated, aristocratic. Bow lips, blue eyes, blonde curls tied with a blue ribbon. She spoke, stretching her words slightly and pausing meaningfully. "Jasper, what kind of shirt are you wearing? A man with your musculature shouldn't be wearing yellow." It wasn't until a month later that they switched to you. Jasper hadn't even dreamed of kissing his date. She was fragile, she'd fall apart. But he silently circled around his dream, suffering in silence. He carried bouquets of wildflowers to every date, and she graciously placed them in a painted jug on the veranda. Then she agreed to a couple hours of walks, all the while striving to get back to the choreography machine. 2 years passed. Another gentleman in Jasper's place would have gone mad with the storm of warring desires, but he bravely endured it all. A few times they kissed, almost like pioneers. That was his entire love crop. When Stacy turned 18, he went matchmaking on his own, without parents or friends. The girl lived with a rather prim mother and grandmother, always dressed in slightly old-fashioned dresses and sundresses, with strange hairstyles and faces without a single touch of makeup. Jasper then thought, not modern relatives, it's not a problem. I don't have to live with them, but with my dream. There are all kinds of people. This is not yet the most unusual option. On the proposal to marry him, Stacy, to the complete amazement of Jasper, responded with consent. Her mother and grandmother nodded with a smart, solemn look. They canceled the lavish wedding feast and decided it would be better to use the money to organize a honeymoon trip. That way the young people could get to know each other better. Jasper counted the days and hours until the date set in August. He booked a hotel in a seaside resort. The parents paid for 2 weeks in the hotel, thinking that it would be the best gift for the children on their wedding day. The groom after school at that time was already working at a construction site, working hard as a bricklayer. The bride was all in art. Having received a certificate, she entered the School of Culture at the dance department. Neither could boast of high earnings. Jasper and Stacy were married at the township hall. The table was set in the yard of Jasper's parents' house. The territory of a cozy gazebo, a barbecue, and a large wooden table allowed it. The guests were few 5 guys from Jasper's martial arts section and strong girls from Stacy's dance group. Yes, parents on both sides, including Grandma. Before the vacation, the newlyweds reached Isabella, burning with impatience. Finally, he could be with his chosen one. Stacy didn't seem to care at all about Jasper's inner turmoil about their wedding night. It was as if it wasn't an important part of a strong marriage at all. Jasper dared not discuss it with her, or anything else for that matter. He was always in a stupor when it came to this side of their relationship. He sincerely thought of Stacy as not a roommate and himself as not a whole man. He agonized, how am I going to be with this delicate, fragile creature? What if I do something wrong? Before the wedding, the guys in the section laughed at him. Jasper, how will you handle your ballerina? No one around him knew that the poor guy had already gone to another city for the weekend, met a funny girl in a bar, and spent 2 days with her in her cramped apartment. The lead singer had absolutely no complexes in matters of love. In 48 hours, Jasper had learned all the science from A to Z. He was afraid of appearing inexperienced in front of Stacy and kept his voyage, which he didn't consider shameful, hidden from even his closest buddies. He wasn't a womanizer, much less a womanizer. That was his only misstep. He couldn't explain to himself why he didn't want Stacy to be his first. It was as if his gut was telling him not to. The hotel struck the young men with its splendor. The first floor was full of cafes, restaurants, stores, and beauty salons. Their two-room suite overlooking the sea had such mesmerizing views that it was breathtaking. And what was the outdoor swimming pool like here? You wouldn't want to go to the sea. Stacy still showed no excitement about the scenery around them, and at the restaurant for dinner she only picked at the appetizingly fried fish with her fork and took a couple of sips of white wine. Jasper could think of nothing but the fact that he would soon be alone with his beloved. Everything that happened in the room left him with a double impression. On the one hand, what he'd been waiting for over 2 years had happened, but Stacy was somehow bland, obeying him in everything. No emotion, like a doll. She got up like a robot and went to wash up. It was nothing like he'd imagined it would be. What was so much mystery about it? On the other hand, he wondered endlessly, was I so bad as to disappoint my young wife so much the conversation they had had before their first wedding night also puzzled him. I understand perfectly well, Jasper, that it is my duty to fulfill my marital duty. But for God's sake, don't talk about children, and don't forget to use protection. In fact, take care of it yourself. In my line of work, having offspring is nonsense. Pregnancy and childbirth would ruin my flawless figure forever. The first pebbles of doubt they dropped resoundingly to the still empty bottom exploded in Jasper's head into 1,000 shards. He was still very much in love with his graceful dancer, but the insidious germ of doubt had taken its first roots in his soul. Then they bathed a lot in the sea and pool, walked along the promenade, as he dreamed, rode the cable car, went to cafes and restaurants. Stacy ordered only diet food. She could munch on a leaf. I can't go back. Barbara woke up and asked the doctor to tell her husband she was gone. As a child, Barbara was considered strange in the yard because she wasn't afraid of dentists. When other children were dragged into the doctor's office with tantrums and tear-stained faces, Barbara was eager to peer through the narrow slit of the door and see what was going on. She wasn't afraid during dental treatment. Maybe because she didn't eat a lot of sweets. Or maybe because everything that was happening aroused the girl's keen interest. She followed every movement of the doctors, and afterwards asked a million questions, flapping her naive, childish eyes. The sound of the drill, white coats, all this was an outlandish world for 8-year-old Barbara. It was no surprise to anyone that after graduating from high school, the girl firmly decided to become a dentist. All high school, she diligently prepared, learned chemical formulas, and diligently solved tests in biology. Sometimes Barbara put on a white coat at home, a cap, and imagined that she was seeing patients. She had once borrowed it from a neighbor who worked as a pediatrician at the local clinic. "What do you want to pick other people's teeth, Barbara?" sighed her mother, stirring the borscht. "Well, you want to teach cranky children," parried the daughter, not taking her eyes off the book. "You must be like your grandmother," grinned the woman. "Only she treated livestock and farms. And you've decided to get to people, too." Barbara grinned understandingly. Grandma Angie had worked as a zoo technician in the village for a long time before she retired. Before and after, she had often been asked by the manager to come and check on the animals and attend to difficult cow deliveries. At the same time, Grandma was not shy to cover with selective profanity young graduates of the Veterinary Institute, who had just arrived at the farm and did not even know that it was dangerous to approach the cows and horses from behind. When the farm was disbanded, the tough-tongued old woman continued to be called by the locals. So as long as there were a couple of cows in the village, there was plenty of work. Angie lived where she'd worked half her life in a village near Swan. Barbara's mom, Lexi, took a different path. She didn't want to live in the village and went to the city, hoping to fit in and achieve a higher rank than honorary milkmaid. However, the city did not treat Lexi as favorably as she would have liked. The woman did not advance further than an elementary school teacher, but received a small one-room apartment in the last years of the union for seniority. The kind where the kitchen was already cramped for 2 people. That's where Barbara was born and raised. No matter how cozy it was under her mother's wing, but at the age of 15 the girl thought about living separately. But no way. The modest salary of a teacher did not allow such a luxury. Her father stayed with them for a short time. Like many truckers, he lived for 2 families, of which neither of them knew. In the end, the man simply did not return from another trip. The mother waited 6 months, and then, gathering her courage, filed for a unilateral divorce. Barbara was secretly sad. She loved her father, and she missed his care, advice, and experience. However, after such a prank, her mother did not start any new relationships. She lived with her work and her daughter. The final exams came, followed by vacations. And now Barbara stood in front of the doors of the medical school, struggling with shyness to enter. She had passed by countless times, dreaming of how she would get her student card and credits. But now the familiar outer walls seemed stark and intimidating, even though the fulfillment of her dream depended on them. It felt strange. "Hey, sophomore year?" Someone touched her elbow. Barbara turned around and saw a blonde girl with a pointy nose and strange, age-inappropriate, brightly colored hairpins. "Yeah, from the second one," Barbara replied. "Cool." The stranger glowed and clapped Barbara on the shoulder in an overly brotherly way. "At last I found someone. My name is Kate, by the way." Barbara, she introduced herself. Like the Crimean Shipoklak, laughed a new acquaintance. "Let's go find our group and audience." Without waiting for an answer, Kate pulled Barbara by the hand toward the entrance. Perhaps the new classmate was the push Barbara needed to take the next step toward her goal. No one she knew from high school had gotten into medical school, and she felt a little insecure here. There was a sea of new faces around. Many had come to study from the countryside. "I came from the village of Savlevo. It's 200 kilometers from here," Kate whispered in the classroom. "Where are you from?" "I'm a local. I grew up here in the city," Barbara answered. She didn't really want to be reprimanded in her first class, but her roommate apparently liked to talk. On the other hand, she needed to make new friends in the student body. "Cool. I always wanted to live in the city. But my parents wouldn't let me leave the village until I finished school." Kate rolled her eyes. Barbara stared blankly at her new acquaintance. The skirt, the blouse, the shoes that had been the trend in town last year. Bright shadows and thick lashes. Apparently, fashion was delayed in reaching the hinterlands. "I want to be a beautician. That in our village, no one knows how to take care of themselves, then poultices, then lapping. It's horrible." Kate said it so loudly that she caught the teacher's questioning look. When the danger passed, she expressively poked a finger with bright green lacquer on her eyelids and whispered, "I'll also be a makeup artist. See, there is already success. Girlfriends for the wedding all written out." "Yes, I'm sure you have." Barbara held back a smile, looking at the bright spots on her face. The pressure, simplicity, and naivete with which Kate communicated both repelled and attracted her at the same time. There was no frostiness of city girlfriends in her. She had a rustic, birch log-like openness that all country folk had. "What are you going to do? Give shots or nurse?" Kate blew her bangs back and stared at Barbara questioningly. "I plan to be a dentist," she answered. "It's been a dream of mine since I was a kid." "Oh well, you'll think of it." She waved her hand. It seemed that Kate and Barbara had gradually become friends, despite their different personalities and goals. The calm, reserved Barbara and the energetic, talkative Kate from the village formed an amusing couple. Studying in medical school was not easy, as teachers at school and Barbara's mother warned. Medicine does not tolerate amateurs, and students from the first year were seriously loaded. At times, Barbara fell asleep over her notes, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of new information. Early rises and the long drive to the institute were also exhausting. But most importantly, her childhood dream was getting closer. Unlike Barbara, Kate didn't work too hard. She often read magazines in her classes, could sleep through classes, and saw going to the institute only as an excuse to dress up. "You'll be expelled after the first session," Barbara sometimes warned her careless friend. "Oh, I just need a cosmetologist license," Kate said. The girls seemed to be going their separate ways, but their friendship only grew stronger. Barbara admired Kate's openness and simplicity, which she lacked, and Kate, perhaps, envied her city friend's tenacity and determination. They had fun contrasting their different personalities and views on their studies. "But to get a diploma, you have to pass the exams at least satisfactorily," Barbara stopped her. "I have enough knowledge for a satisfactory," Kate, the village fashionista, said confidently. Kate wasn't really that lazy. She just had a different approach. Instead of cramming every day, she preferred to stay up the night before the seminar to answer without forgetting what she had read. She took notes from her roommates and kept her textbooks and manuals on the table in her room just for show. Kate was not lazy also because she immediately began to look for part-time jobs. To be more precise, they found it themselves to hand out flyers in the dormitory, or something somewhere to carry for a little money. So by the end of the semester, she was invited to work as a barista for evening shifts in a small coffee shop. Kate brewed coffee a little better than the cleaning lady, but made eyes at all the visitors and smiled. Thanks to her rustic spontaneity and simplicity, her 32 teeth left good tips, on which the girl bought cosmetics and new handbags. This rustic directness and simplicity helped her where it was more difficult for city people. Kate was not afraid to seem stupid, and it always went to her advantage. She also had her own goal, and the girl went her own way to it. Barbara always had fun with Kate. She knew the latest gossip, had a lot of funny stories to tell, and could do her friends' makeup in the bathroom before class. On one of the frosty days before the session, Barbara stood at the bus stop waiting for the bus. Several other people were crowding along with her. Time was running out, and the bus was still missing. The elderly women behind Barbara were getting louder and louder. A man in an old-fashioned fur hat, carrying a briefcase like Novoseltsev from the movie Service Romance, finally couldn't stand it and asked the driver of the next bus, "Where did the 14th route go?" "They abolished them all," he shrugged indifferently. "Now it's only a transfer to the center." Rumors that this bus would be abolished had been circulating for a long time. But as always, everything happened at the most inopportune moment. The man in the fur hat swore loudly, not embarrassing the passengers, and hurriedly began to call a cab. Clara realized that she would have to do the same to avoid being late. As luck would have it, the first pair was a seminar with a very picky professor from the Higher School of Economics who wouldn't let latecomers in. To get to the institute, Barbara gave away all her money, even scraped change from the farthest pockets. She ran into the auditorium a moment before the bell rang and, breathing loudly, plopped down on the bench next to Kate. "Where have you been?" "I was already thinking about how to get you out of school," she pounced on her friend with questions. "My bus doesn't run anymore," Barbara complained, laying out her notebook. "I don't know how I'm going to get here. It's either a detour across the city or a cab." "So you should move into my dorm," Kate said. 5 minutes and you're at school. Just remember to brush your teeth." Barbara wanted to say something against it, but suddenly realized that it wasn't a bad idea. And if she had to choose between an extra early rise and an expensive cab, Kate and the dormitory was the better option. After all, she'd wanted to live on her own for a long time. Student room fees were ridiculous. She spent more on commuting from home. And she could go to her mom's on weekends. "My roommate just moved out, so here, as they say, all the cards are aligned." Kate theatrically raised her hands to the ceiling. "You'll have to apply to the building manager, and they'll move you in no time." Barbara nodded. So much time they were wasting traveling. They could have used it for more useful things like studying, walking, and getting a good night's sleep. The superintendent had been a little nagging at Barbara when she'd given her the papers. "What are you doing here?" "I have to put up foreigners from out of town," she grumbled. The girl kept silent, knowing that she was obliged to be accommodated. The commandant once again looked at her with a keen eye, but everything was in order. Eventually, she accepted the application and gave her a check-in date. As soon as they were out of the dormitory, Kate smothered Barbara in a hug so tightly that she gasped. "Yay! Yay, we're together now." Her mother took the news of her daughter's future move with enthusiasm. The mother's apartment was cozy, but cramped. Alas, even a mother's love couldn't change that fact. "Don't eat crap in there," Lexi admonished her daughter as she put towels and a new set of bedding in her bag. "And don't drink. You're the only one who's so willful," she shook her fist rather jokingly, "or that Kate, your tough friend, is going to be a bad influence on you." "She's all right," Barbara defended her friend. "She's just peculiar." A few days later, on a weekend, the girl came to the dormitory with her things. Kate was already waiting for her. She helped her to bring everything in, settle in, showed her where everything was. The room was small, but here Barbara had her own separate bed, a table, a closet, shelves, and a whole wall. All in all, not bad. The main thing was that it was a couple minutes' walk to the university, and she would get used to the rest. That evening, Barbara and Kate were walking down the hallway when a voice called out to them. "Hello, girls." A student peeked out of a nearby room. "Hi, Swan," Kate responded, tilting her head to the side as if looking at a shiny bauble. "What do you want?" "Come join us, because we're lacking female company," he said, waving his hand invitingly. "We'll feed you, give you a drink. We won't leave you with any hard feelings. It's a birthday party, after all." Barbara tugged Kate's elbow questioningly. "It's Swan from third year who's been after me since the beginning of the semester," she whispered back. "He's not a bad guy, but he's a little dorky. Do you want to go?" Barbara took another look at the guy who was urging them on. "Why not?" She shrugged her shoulders. Kate stared at her. "Tomorrow's Sunday anyway. No need to go anywhere. We'll sit around and talk, all of us. Nothing to be afraid of," she turned to Swan. "Okay, we'll be there soon." The guy glowered, gave them a thumbs up and disappeared into the room. Barbara studied for a while, but then she thought about it. She hadn't really made friends with anyone except Kate in the 6 months she'd been at school. Sure, she'd hung out with her classmates, but it wasn't the same. Barbara's old school friends visited less and less often and wrote shorter and shorter letters, because everyone had enough to worry about. And they didn't understand why she was going to an institute across town. Kate quickly combed her hair, changed from pants to jeans, and found a decent t-shirt in the closet. Barbara didn't bother, limiting herself to brushing her hair. There were 3 guys and a girl in the room, apparently the couple of the birthday boy, tall, thin as a pole, but very hospitable. Swan, an old acquaintance, greeted the girls and introduced the company. "This is Vince, the birthday boy, and his girlfriend Susan. This is Simon, the city's future medical luminary. And this is Jasper," he said, pointing his finger at a boy sitting in a chair by the window. "Matthew from the journalism department." The girls were warmly welcomed and seated at the communal table. After a while, the shyness of the acquaintance evaporated without a trace. Everyone drank, ate, joked. Susan suggested playing crocodile. The boys readily moved the bed, making room. Barbara stared blankly at all the new acquaintances. Jasper was making small talk with Kate. It was obvious that he liked her, whether he was trying to hug her, picking an invisible speck off her shoulder, or whispering something in her ear. Vince and Susan had been together a long time. It was obvious from their conversation and their warmth toward each other. Barbara felt a twinge of distant envy. She'd dated a guy in high school, but he'd never treated her with such care and warmth. Simon made occasional jokes about doctors. During breaks, when his mouth wasn't busy eating, he'd already put a couple ketchup stains on his shirt. But would that stop a man with a big appetite? Matthew, the only one Jasper had introduced differently than the others, didn't fit at the table. He sat by the window with his plate in his hands. But that didn't stop the young man from collecting all the stares. He told stories, joked, asked provocative questions, and posed picturesquely. "Matthew's a talker," Vince said. "He's a man who's chosen his profession to talk." The party turned into an interesting argument about professions and vocations. When Matthew spoke disparagingly of medicine, comparing it to picking on people, Barbara stood up for Simon. "What's wrong with helping people?" she asked suddenly. Everyone fell silent and stared at her with interest. Matthew also looked at her. "You're not going to help them for free, are you? Or are you going to open a branch of the Mother Teresa Society?" He sarcastically parried Barbara. "I want to help first of all. I'm going into the profession because of my heart, not because it's profitable," she said. "Okay, and you need to eat. So stop covering your ambition with mercy." Matthew waved his hand at her. "Sooner or later, people will become just a means of earning money for you. But some people will earn money by talking, and others by seeing rotten teeth and other unpleasant things in the human body." "Matthew, come on. This is the 3rd year you've been arguing with us," Vince said conciliatorily. "All professions are needed, and all have their talents. Let's have a drink and play cards." Barbara gave Matthew an annoyed look, but didn't argue further, so as not to offend the birthday boy. The trouble was, she liked the smug talker. Matthew had the typical flamboyant appearance, chiseled facial features, dark hair, strong charisma, and a sharp mind. Gradually, the angular conversation smoothed out and the tension he'd built up went away. The party had passed midnight when there was a knock on the door. "Shooge," Vince hissed. Commandant. Susan appeared and, cursing everyone, quickly covered the table with a sheet. Girls and boys were hidden under beds and in closets. Everything happened so fast that hardly a fly could have flown in that time. The commandant's voice was heard, reprimanding Vince for the noise and disorder after lights out, and he did his best to show the supposedly empty room. It's like this every time Matthew sighed, shoved into the closet with Barbara on the perfume mountain. Auntie's here, so she'll hide everything in the closets, you idiot. The closet was cramped. Barbara felt her back resting against the guy's chest and almost stepped on his feet. For some reason her cheeks were flaming and her tongue was confused. Matthew touched her shoulder gently as he could do while standing in a closet full of things. I'm sorry, okay, it's my nature to pick at things. It was rude, he said. Without turning around, Barbara replied, Vada. She could feel the guy's guilty breath on the back of her neck. It was getting stuffy. Let's go out tomorrow. As an apology, you pick where Matthew put his hand on her forearm. The commandant let go of the last of her nagging remarks, wagged her finger, and made to leave. Goosebumps ran up and down his body. It was hot and cold at the same time. There was tension in the air again, but it was still enveloping. Come on, Barbara agreed. To the contemporary artists' exhibition at the gallery. Okay. I'll be waiting at the dormitory entrance. The closet doors swung open. So you two didn't have a fight? Vince asked. We did. We almost did. Matthew pulled away. He was the first to jump out, winking discreetly at Barbara. You okay? Why would you go out with that asshole? Kate gave the guy a hard stare. I think we're going on a date with that jerk, Barbara whispered quietly, trying to hide her red cheeks and the stupid love sparkle in her eyes. Barbara Vitalievna, you have golden hands. The grateful patient smiled goodbye and left the office. Barbara took off her gloves and nodded to herself in the mirror. She had gone to the dentist's office for moments like this for grateful looks and sincere appreciation. Wasn't it a shame the years she'd spent studying? First 5 in medical school, then residency. 3 more years for the registry. Barbara took the robe home to wash. She should also call Kate. They were supposed to meet today for a professional holiday. Barbara threw on the coat, said goodbye to the girls at the front desk, and hurried to the store to get a cake. Kate still had a sweet tooth from university. No one was home for her yet. Kieran had warned that he would be at the agency until the evening. He'd started moonlighting there while he was still studying, and 7 years later he'd taken the editor's chair himself. But Kieran had connections with every authority in Swan, from vegetable shops to the prosecutor's office. He and Barbara had married while they were still at university, a year after they'd started their relationship in the dormitory party. Kate had convinced her that Kieran was good, of course, but he was too nosy. Mother and principal did not take the profession of journalism seriously. What kind of job is it, collecting gossip? Like plowing a factory or sowing grain, she used to say. But she was radiant when Barbara came for the weekend and raved about her boyfriend. Kieran was not what he seemed at first glance, nor what everyone else saw him as. He knew how to be caring and sensitive, and even restrained his desire to pick at everything. At the same time remained the soul of the company, a noisy lighter. Many girls openly envied Barbara and openly glared at Kieran when they appeared at the university. There's nothing to see. Kate waved her hands at them. They're not here for the ballet. Shoo. Though she had initially opposed Barbara and Kieran's relationship, she soon became an ardent defender of their peace, and was even a bridesmaid at the wedding. Not without pride, she told the guests that without her, the young couple would not have met. It might have seemed that Kate just had nothing to do, but those who thought so were wrong. She had affairs with 2 or 3 men at once. Never a dull moment in the evening. Sometimes she chose from several candidates and was not ashamed to use her natural beauty. Those problems that she herself did not want to solve suitors. That's how Kate finished her studies, not really knowing what she was studying for. She got her medical degree as a working makeup artist. She did not go to any residency, but sat in a beauty studio, having mastered in addition to makeup, hair and other procedures. From boredom or from power, married and 6 months later divorced. Another year Kate went on dates, and then again went to the registry office. She wasn't lazy, she was just lucky. She was also never shy about doing things that others disapproved of, so she won where others gave up. Barbara sometimes thought her road was straight and quiet, where you could see all the stops and bumps for miles ahead. Kate's road, on the other hand, wriggled like a snake, either falling into potholes or going under the clouds. The important thing was that in the end, they both reached their destination. Finally. Wow. Barbara was just about to call her friend, who was almost an hour late, when she heard a commotion in the entryway and a bell ringing. "Can you believe it, you bastard?" Kate was indignant. "The client was late, delayed me. The cabs were still running." Barbara just smiled. They hugged. It couldn't have been otherwise. Over the years, Kate had changed from a country girl with ambition into a genteel city beauty. She aspired to a brown haircut, was always with makeup, fashionably dressed. And she was more concerned about a new skirt and going for a massage than having groceries at home. "Oh, you didn't cook?" Kate asked, as soon as she entered the kitchen and poked her nose into the pots on the stove and in the refrigerator. "I see piggies." Barbara had borscht, stuffed cabbage, and compote. She didn't chase brands and hairstyles. She dressed minimalistically and simply, but she knew how to keep things cozy and on time. "I'm Simon's boo." "I don't cook anything," Kate complained. "We all have our talents," Barbara reassured her. The casual, friendly conversation went on late into the night. It was always like this when they met. The cake was almost over, and for the third time, Barbara was making coffee. When did Kieran finally come home? The young editor was in a meeting. He'd come into the kitchen, said hello briefly, hugged his wife and retired to his room, saying he'd had a hard day. "Why is he so glum?" Kate asked, glancing at the man. "Tired." I guess Barbara shrugged. "I didn't have to force him to sit at the table." Come on. Kate jumped up from her chair and reached for her friend's shoulder. "What's this?" She picked up her red hair with 2 long fingernails and showed it to the stunned Barbara. She stopped talking in surprise. "Maybe it was an accident," Barbara suggested. "Yeah, you can say it was blown in by the wind." Kate stared at her with her arms at her sides. "I'm a friend of men, I know how they smell." Came in tired, in someone else's hair. Just like he'd been working out. Poor thing, Barbara grinned. "What are you implying? That he, Matthew, has moved on the room?" "I'm not implying anything yet, but it's a fact," Kate shrugged. "We need to watch him, take a closer look. And come on, maybe you had something strange going on." Barbara wondered. Her friend's suspicions had shifted the bricks of her inner fortress. Just a little. But even that was enough to make the edifice faintly shake. Matthew had replaced the father she'd been deprived of in her life. He became both friend and husband at once. For the first few years they lived soul to soul, understood each other without words, and as if a whole universe was formed in the fusion of 2 different characters. Then they experienced several crises in their relationship. There were quarrels, as with everyone, but they quickly became the past. The last year they lived very measured, but loaded professionally. Both worked hard to achieve their goals. Maybe they were socializing less, Barbara speculated aloud. "Is everything okay in bed?" Kate questioned her. "Well, maybe because of the work, maybe a little less," Barbara agreed. Something sticking, Kate nodded. "It's just one hair, and already there's a lot of panic." "Everything starts with a hair," said her friend with an authoritative thumbs up. "I advise you to go through the pockets of his shirt, and in the laptop." "I'm not sniffing shirts." "What the hell are you talking about?" Barbara was indignant, though subconsciously the doubt had already taken hold of her. "Go to his workplace," Kate whispered conspiratorially. "Maybe they've got a red-headed student intern there." They chatted for a while, and Kate started to get ready to go home. "Oh, I almost forgot," she said. "My salon is celebrating its anniversary. Come with your husband next week, Friday. You are my regular customer." "Of course we will," Barbara nodded. "Smell the shirts." Kate winked at her, gave her a kiss, and disappeared into the elevator. Involuntarily, Barbara began to look at her husband. Until Kate's words, she'd never thought of accusing him of cheating. Of course, it was hard to believe, but doubts crept in. One evening, Barbara did go through her husband's things. "God, what am I doing?" she asked herself when she actually sniffed his favorite Matthew shirt. It didn't smell anything suspicious. There was no foreign hair. Barbara calmed down and put Kate's words out of her mind. Kate is Kate, and my Matthew isn't like that. She had long ago accepted his job and the need to socialize with different people. Little did she know who the meeting might have been with. This is all silly. "Mish, we're all right, aren't we?" Barbara asked on the way to the cafe, not knowing why she was asking. The inner restlessness hadn't completely gone away. "Yes, why are you suddenly asking?" Matthew wondered. "You can't tell me that Kate found a hair," Barbara thought. "You've been away at work lately, and we haven't talked much." "Barbara, but you know I have a lot of things to do and a lot of responsibilities." Matthew smiled. "I'll get an assistant soon and relax a little." Oh. Here we are. Kate was waiting for them at the entrance to the cafe, looking drunk and in full battle paint. She was friends with the owner of the salon and had even bought out a small share of the business, so she could invite anyone to the party. Barbara sometimes wondered where careless Kate got the money, but the mystery remained a mystery. The mini-corporate party was a lot of fun. The women's company was diluted by a few men: the owner's husband, the masseur's boyfriend, and Barbara and Kate's husbands. Barbara didn't know her friend's new husband. She had only seen him at the wedding and didn't remember where he'd come from. Simon looked frankly bored. He constantly touched his champagne glass, sighed, and took part in the general festivities very languidly. The hostess raffled off certificates for free treatments among the guests. Barbara successfully won one of them and hurried to please her husband, who went outside for a smoke. She jumped out of the door and looked around puzzled. Only Kate was outside, talking on the phone. "Have you seen Matthew?" her friend asked her. Kate put the phone away in her purse. "Of course I have. While you were participating in the raffle, your husband poured wine on his pants and went to change his clothes," she shouted. "And we have a delivery of new manicure tables. The idiots just mixed up the days. I rushed to the salon to receive, so that everything did not disrupt. Ciao. You two have fun." Kate jumped into a cab and sped away. A puzzled Barbara dialed Matthew. He confirmed that he had doused his pants, was changing, and would be back soon. "Miss me?" She heard a voice from behind her. Simon came out of the door. Barbara responded machine generously. "No." They had said hello very crumply in the first few minutes. The girl wondered why her husband had not warned her and had left so hastily. "Let's talk, shall we?" Simon kept up. "I don't know anyone here but you. There's nothing to talk about with these chickens in salons. They're all talking about manicures and new hair colors." He yawned tiredly and flicked his lighter. "Come on," Barbara agreed, realizing she was in a similar situation. Simon asked about his work, his habits, his studies, only moving on to talk about himself. He complained about Kate, overtly or covertly. Barbara knew he was drunk, but for some reason she listened. She'd never talked to someone in such a way about her friend, as if she'd been given a glimpse into a secret suitcase. "She cooks once a week, and it's impossible to eat," Simon complained. "I'm used to home-cooked food," Simon sighed. "My mom was a cook all her life, and here Ben from morning till night. Do you want borscht? Cutlets? Pie she'll buy soldiers, or say, eat dumplings, honey yuck, but at night she wears makeup until 3 o'clock. Then why did you marry her?" Cautiously switched to you, Barbara. "She's beautiful. She's a pain in the ass." I couldn't take my eyes off her. When I saw her, everything reasonable changed in my head. But now I realize you can't eat beauty alone. Simon moved closer and whispered. "I gave her money for a share in that damn salon for some reason. I thought she'd stop hanging around there and be home and earning an income. No way." Barbara felt sorry for Simon. She realized that his rose-colored glasses were broken. On the one hand, he'd seen who he'd married. On the other hand, beauty had always clouded men's judgment. "I wish I had a wife like you," Barbara, Simon said, looking into her eyes. A calm, responsible, domestic wife, ready to raise children, not plaster chickens in front of the mirror. Barbara endured and climbed out of Simon's palms, who had already managed to get a grip on her fingers. "I don't think this is a good idea," the girl cut him short. "It's time for us to go back inside." She turned and walked quickly into the cafe. Her heart was pounding frantically. There was bewilderment and awkwardness in her mind. Barbara sat down in her seat at the table and poured half a glass of wine. Should she tell Kate what had happened? Complaints, harassment, and innuendo. Kate would start questioning him. They'll fight. They'll have to rehash the whole thing. No, let them deal with their own problems. Barbara sipped her wine and reached for a sandwich. For some reason, she felt very bad. She wanted to hug Kieran. He'd disappeared for some reason. She called. Her husband answered that he was almost there, but he was stuck in traffic. Finally, he walked into the cafe in jeans and a t-shirt. About 10 minutes later, a panting Kate burst in. She was desperately arguing on the phone with someone. "What kind of idiots are these? This isn't a company, it's a silent horror." Kate threw the phone with force on the table next to her. "Not only did they show up on the wrong day, but they almost hurt me." She pointed to a barely visible bruise on her elbow and an abrasion on her forearm. "I'm sorry it took so long." Barbara Kieran hugged her from behind. "The traffic would drive you crazy." "Why didn't you warn me?" Barbara asked. "I was standing in the middle of the hall with, pardon me, wet pants." Kieran waved his hands guiltily. "I didn't have time to talk. I hurried to the car and rushed to change my pants." Kate continued to murmur and fuss nearby. Barbara calmed down a little when she felt her husband's hand on her arm. At the other end of the table, Simon sat silent and glared at her through the wall of a clear glass. Several days passed. Barbara was finishing up her work at the clinic. Her mood was good. The last 8-year-old patient had been a delight to her with his bravery and resilience. He even hugged the doctor's aunt goodbye. And under his mom's proud gaze, embarrassedly said thank you. Of course, Barbara could not just let the little hero out of the office and handed him a brand new toothbrush, which was left by the brand representative for promotional purposes. The young doctor had already said goodbye to all her colleagues and was standing at the door when the phone in her pocket rang. It was Kate. "Help me out, come model," heard her voice in the phone. "My student and I need to practice, and the model is sick, the bastard." "Now?" Barbara was surprised. "Yes, it's urgent," Kate begged. "Okay, I'll be right there." Barbara hung up the phone. She often helped her friend out. It was easy and pleasant. After all, she always came home with her makeup and hair done, and Kate's training was never disrupted. It took Barbara about half an hour to get to the salon. She was already waiting, sat in a chair, and under the popular tracks of the radio air Kate and her student began to work. The friend was scattered in another gratitude and scolded the irresponsible student model, who did not come. When the work was done and the student went home, the makeup artist offered Barbara to stay and have a cup of coffee. "It turned out very favorably," said her friend, looking at the makeup. "She's a smart girl. Maybe something good will come out of her." Barbara clapped her eyelashes theatrically. She turned to one side or the other. At the same time, she caught a glimpse of the old manicure and tables. "I thought you said your tables were going to be replaced?" She stared questioningly at her makeup artist friend. "Where are they?" "They turned out to be defective. We sent them back." The makeup artist waved her hand. "What, all at once?" Barbara wondered. "They all had scratched countertops. I told you, those idiot movers were banging them against each other like crazy." The makeup artist waved her hand. "Pull the brushes. Fucking detectives. They only spoiled our holiday and frayed our nerves." "Did they hit you with the tables too?" Barbara nodded at the greenish bruise on the makeup artist's elbow. "Yeah, the makeup artist didn't even look at her arm. They opened the door. As if to my home, I was sealed in for company." Friends finished their coffee and long ago switched to another topic, when the makeup artist, who was scrolling through the news feed on her phone, suddenly exclaimed, "Larchik, look." She shoved a machine with a picture open on the screen to Barbara's nose. The girl looked at the picture and froze. On the photo was the entire staff of the agency where her husband worked. The guys were holding some certificates in their hands. Apparently another award from their superiors. But another thing was interesting. Next to her husband stood a young red-haired girl. "Aha," shouted her friend triumphantly. "And I told you to frame." "I'd say so," Barbara said, looking at the photograph. I felt sick to my stomach. The nasty feeling from the conversation with her friend and her husband resurfaced again. "That's from finding the red hair," said the makeup artist friend. "It's okay, we exposed him." She clenched her hand into a fist. "If anything, we'll be the first to file for divorce." "What divorce?" Barbara jumped up. Her face was burning. "It's not clear yet." "It's clear as day," her friend said authoritatively, folding her arms across her chest. "Your husband's on the prowl. We've got to go over there and rip that redhead's hair out." Barbara clutched her temples with her hands. "I don't believe in this nonsense." "Okay," agreed the makeup artist. "We'll watch him very carefully this week. Men always leave their fingers in the details." Barbara nodded. She wanted to hint to her friend about her boyfriend's behavior, but she didn't. She could say too much out of resentment, especially since the makeup artist was just drawing her own conclusions, a bit obsessive. But so far there was no one to take offense at or for. Barbara's husband was behaving normally. The makeup artist began to surreptitiously follow her friend's husband, something she normally never did. Until that day, Barbara thought that there was no point in restricting the freedom of a partner, forbidding something, scandals or jealousy scenes. She had realized this in her student days. Although she loved her husband very much, admired him as a man and a person. The more you control, the higher the probability of the opposite effect, she pondered. And to arrange emotional swings with yelling at her husband is a noisy and dangerous task. Scenes and emotions are enough for him at work. At home he wants peace. He said so himself. During the day, the young editor, like a chameleon, adjusted to anyone who came into his office, and in the evening at home he wanted to be himself. Feeling like a delinquent schoolgirl, Barbara rummaged through her husband's backpack, his notebook while he was in the shower. On the pages of the notebook, she found a list of phone numbers and women's names. In his jacket pocket, a strange pink-colored pen. Her heart pounded loudly, echoing in her ears like it had been covered with a bucket. "What are you doing?" The husband stood in the doorway, staring at his wife in amazement. Barbara froze with the evidence she had found in her hands. "Are you accusing me of something?" Kieran folded his arms across his chest. "What is it?" Barbara jabbed her finger at the list of numbers. "Are these the candidates for the assistant position?" Her husband shrugged indifferently. "I was interviewing last week. I wrote everyone down here." "What?" "I wrote these down." Kieran waved a pink pen in the air. "First with mine. Then I ran out of paste and Stacy lent me her writing utensils. What's the problem?" "Why are you going through my stuff?" Kieran glanced around at the slight mess on the desk. His nostrils were dilating. Barbara felt like a fool. She muttered something under her breath, slipped the notebook and pen to her husband, and left for the kitchen. His explanations were convincing, but the worm of paranoia continued to gnaw its way through her thoughts. Barbara crushed her whiskey with her hands and sat down at the table in the kitchen. She grabbed her phone and texted Kate about what had happened. The makeup artist didn't believe her friend's husband's excuses and offered to follow up with him just in case. Barbara looked at her schedule, figured something out, and texted back. "Do it." "Where?" She went to bed late. Kieran was already on his 10th nap when she finally settled down. Before doing so, Barbara had spent a long time gazing into her sleeping husband's face, trying to find answers to her questions in him. In the morning, she got ready, pretended nothing had happened, walked Kieran to work, and waited for Kate. Her friend arrived just as Kieran rolled out of the yard. Dunkate's voice was filled with a poorly concealed excitement, as if she'd been waiting a long time for permission. "I have a choice." "Look," Barbara looked at her. "Put your seatbelt on in the car." "Well, you might not like what you see if you see anything," Kate corrected herself, shrugging. "But I'd rather not see anything, of course." He's gotten kind of distant, Barbara murmured as they caught up with Kieran on the road and pulled a few cars ahead of them. He seemed fine, but something was wrong. That's how it starts, Kate nodded, gazing down the road. First they're in love, and then they start lying. They can't fool our feminine instincts. Did your previous husband cheat on you? Barbara suddenly blurted out for some reason. Kate jerked faintly at the wheel, so caught off guard by the question. Sami, was he cheating? Very likely, she said uncertainly. But I didn't care. I went on dates. I realized I was sick of Sami. I wish I'd told him when I'd filed for divorce in bed. Aren't you afraid that Simon might cheat on you? Barbara was so emotional she could barely contain the urge to tell the truth. Simon? Please. Kate waved her hand, instantly relaxed. He's head over heels in love with me, like a dog, always waiting. Is he that in love? Barbara muttered to herself so Kate wouldn't hear. They pulled into the parking lot outside Kieran's work. His car was already there. There was a long ambush ahead. Kate promptly ran to the nearest stall for coffee and scones. Napping in the car took until lunchtime. Kate nudged Barbara in the shoulder as Kieran came out of the agency with the red-haired girl from the photo. They got into the car and got ready to drive out. Let's go, lovebirds. We'll get them now, Kate muttered excitedly, twisting the steering wheel. Barbara watched her husband's car with bated breath. She recognized the girl in the photo. Kieran had said it was his assistant. But was it just that? The answer to that question loomed somewhere on the horizon. The editor and her companion made a trip to the city's utility and stationery store. On the whole, there were no provocative moments, except for opening the door for the girl. She carried a folder with documents, sometimes asking Kieran something or answering the phone. He hardly ever took his eyes off the phone, even while driving. Yeah, he's holding the door for you, just in case Kate noticed Kieran's gesture, almost mockingly. He always does that, Barbara replied, following her husband with her eyes. Look, why don't you call him right now, Kate suggested. Ask him what he's doing and see what the answer is. Barbara dialed the number and waited. Kieran's phone was busy, but he switched the call almost immediately and picked up. Hi, did you pick up lunch? She blurted out. Hello? No, I'm eating in the cafeteria. Don't worry, her husband answered in a completely calm voice. All right, Barbara stretched out. How's the day? Are you socializing for work? Yes, came the reply. Why are you calling? No reason, Barbara lied, suspecting that her husband had suspected something. I'll see you tonight. Bye. Kate listened to the conversation with her arms folded across her chest. He didn't say he was traveling with a woman. She waggled her eyebrows expressively. He's hiding, all right. Her wooden confidence pierced the last shield of doubt in Barbara's chest. Why the hell does he even need an assistant? Kate snapped her hands together in indignation. It was like he'd spent 2 years cooking and doing everything himself. And here, all of a sudden, the ambition of the head of the brain. I don't know, Barbara said, staring blankly out the window. Tired, I guess. Yeah, from work or from his wife, Kate said wryly. Kate drove home, leaving Barbara alone to deal with the aftermath of the evening. Are you white or red, drinking? Kate asked mischievously before leaving. That evening, Kieran found the 2 drunken girlfriends at home. Barbara couldn't get Kate out of the house for about an hour. She asked for a drink for a nightcap. Then she was hugging. Then she lost something in her bag. Finally, Simon arrived and took his raging wife himself. He cast an interested and questioning glance at Barbara, and they left. At that moment, her husband seemed to Barbara the best and most innocent. She fell dreamily asleep, hugging her pillow, whispering something with only her lips. Kieran sat in the chair and waited for his wife to fall asleep. He did not scold her, did not lecture her. He only set the alarm clock, put a couple of pain pills on the table, and put a glass of water. Then he went out, hesitating briefly in the doorway, as if in doubt. But the second confusion lasted only a moment. The man looked at the sleeping Barbara, nodded to himself, and closed the bedroom door. After that evening, Barbara became nervous and irritable. She began to be late for work. For the first time, Barbara snapped at a patient who drove to her from across town. "Barbara, why don't you take a vacation?" The receptionist girls at the front desk asked sympathetically. "Can I take a vacation?" the doctor replied, wrinkling her forehead tensely. She was beginning to notice a cooling in her and Kieran's relationship. He hugged her dryly, he forgot the usual little things, or he dropped her calls and returned them himself. Barbara remembered the way the other female students had looked at him during their studies. Kieran had always stood out. He was passionate, charismatic, had a great sense of humor, and a sharp mind. Next to him, she sometimes felt she was falling short. Over the years, Kieran has not lost any of his appeal, and even became brighter. "You've got a paycheck today. Go to the mall, buy yourself something, a dress, shoes, and the mood will improve," advised a colleague Barbara. It was a good idea. In all the commotion, she had almost forgotten that it was the height of summer, and that she didn't have to be cramped in stupid jeans and the infamous t-shirts. Barbara called Kate and suggested that they go shopping together after work. But her friend cited busyness and declined. At the mall, the windows were full of sales and posters, mannequins towering between the rows of clothes. Barbara remembered the pants and styles of dresses Kate had recommended to her the day before and began to walk along the racks. After choosing a few options, she went to the fitting rooms. What a pleasant surprise. She heard behind her as she came out to assess her outfit in the large mirror in front of the booths. Barbara turned around and saw Simon. The man had wandered into the mall, apparently for the same reason I had. A closet update, she thought. "Well, this is a surprise," Barbara grumbled. "Hello, Simon. The dress fits perfectly." The boy gave her a thumbs up. "Take it, don't hesitate." This time he was fresh and had a positive attitude. Old memories that had lived along with his appearance slid unpleasantly down her back. "Barbara, I wanted to apologize," Simon began, putting his hands behind his head shyly. "I got drunk in that cafe because I was nervous and tired. I was talking nonsense. I'm sorry I acted like a total asshole." Barbara was surprised, pleasantly surprised. "It happened," she said. "What are you doing here?" She glanced at the store, as if to confirm the question. I closed the deal nervously, exhaled at work, and decided to buy myself a long-standing dream. I wanted a computer. Simon nodded at the bag from the hardware store. And the new jeans were a bonus. Barbara looked at the jeans appraisingly. "Don't think twice about getting them too." She smiled slightly. Even this sudden company in Simon's face was good for her for some reason. Maybe it distracted her from her obsessive thoughts. Maybe she needed a counselor, or maybe it was something else. "Kate's all worked up, and she won't come with me," he said as they left the store. "Busy with me today," too, Barbara confirmed. "How about some coffee? Or was there something else you wanted to buy?" Barbara thought that the underwear shopping would have to be postponed, and nodded in agreement, approving the coffee idea. In the cafeteria, she tried to pay for it herself, but Simon was the first to arrive and put a fragrant drink and a small dessert in front of her. Barbara hadn't ordered the latter. "Oh, come on." As a friend of a best friend, Simon said, "We're practically related." He didn't have time to say anything before he heard a text message from the bank. "Why?" Simon stared sourly at Barbara, looking at the balance on the card. "Almost, but not related," she commented briefly. They chatted, then went back down to the shopping floors and wandered for a long time, picking out one pretty thing or another. Barbara felt that she was enjoying Simon's company. He didn't play the fool like he had in the cafe, but was cheerful and relaxed. At the same time, he talked about all sorts of funny situations at work, reminisced about old friends and years of schooling. There was even room for a story about Simon's childhood in the village and his happy vacations. Listening to all this, Barbara did the most important thing: distracted herself from obsessive thoughts about her husband's love. Barbara realized it was time to go home. The time was approaching evening. She hailed a cab as they stood at the entrance to the mall. "Thanks for the company on the shopping trip," Barbara smiled as the cab pulled up. "Thank you for the pleasant walk. Maybe we could do it again sometime." Simon opened the cab door for her. This probably isn't the right thing to do, Barbara said. Simon gave her a quick peck on the cheek and said, "Well, you're a big girl. It's time to get your priorities straight." Barbara drove home. Stunned, outraged, all the emotions of the last few days were mixed up in her. Resentment toward her husband, worry about their personal life, irritation, and in all of it, there were sparks of hints from Simon. It's wrong. It's not right that she's having coffee with Kate's best friend's husband, who's making ambiguous innuendos to her for the second time. Why? Well, of course she knows why. She knows she loves Kieran too. She knew that she valued Kate as a friend and a loved one. And she knew she wasn't ready to go along with what Simon was veiledly offering her. Plain and simple. But then why was she flattered by his attention? Wasn't it compensation for a grudge from Kieran? How long had it been since he'd spent nearly half of his day off with her? The more Barbara thought about it, the more the questions became, leading her down a dead end. Tomorrow I'll talk to Kieran straight, Barbara decided, and tell Kate the truth about her husband. That will be the proper prioritization. The next day, Barbara had few patience, so she got off early after work. On the way, a nervous Kieran called her and asked her to bring her work phone, which she had forgotten at home. On the way, she thought about the best words to say to her friend and her husband. She decided to start with the first one. She dialed Kate's number and proposed to meet in the evening. The makeup artist happily replied that she agreed and even asked if she should dress up in front of her. "No, we'll just hang out," was the reply. As Barbara entered the apartment, she heard Kieran's work phone ringing. She picked it up near the mirror in the hallway and glanced at the screen absently. There were about 10 missed calls, some news reports. Greg, Barbara mumbled as she glanced at the call sheets on her smartphone. She was already getting into a cab when a text message sent around 1:00 in the morning caught her eye. "Missed you, my affectionate boss." Looking forward to tomorrow, Barbara felt as if she had been doused with cold water. There it was. Here were her suspicions. Here, in her hands, on the screen of her husband's phone. Tears came to her eyes. Her nose crinkled and her throat was filled with rage and jealousy. Barbara caught her gaze in the rearview mirror and was stunned. She was looking at an angry and deceived woman, hungry for revenge and justice. All plans to talk to her husband were forgotten at that moment. "The boss." Then Barbara whispered, clutching the phone so tightly that it nearly cracked. The cab driver involuntarily glanced at the passenger. He instinctively sensed that something was going on behind him. The only thing the girl managed to do before her jealousy finally drowned her was to write down the number from which the text message had come. Barbara burst into the agency's office with flaming cheeks. The staff said hello to her, but the girl didn't hear them. She yanked Kieran's office door open to the astonished stares, but it wouldn't budge. "Kieran Sergeyevich isn't here. He's at lunch," said a fellow practicing journalism student timidly. "What's going on here?" he asked, being the first to catch Barbara's furious glare. "We'll wait for him here," she said. Barbara stared angrily at the empty assistant's chair next to the office and plopped down in it. Tapping her fingers expectantly on the tabletop, she felt a mixture of fear and bewilderment from the entire office. Someone had apparently called Kieran on the sly, and he'd rushed in a couple minutes later. "Did you have a good meal, love?" Barbara said sarcastically, getting up from her chair and shoving the phone screen with the text message angrily up his nose. At the same time, she glared angrily at Stacy, who was frozen in the doorway behind the chief with a stack of papers. "Barbara, what's the concert?" Kieran questioned, trying to lead his wife into the office. "Come on, let's talk quietly." Barbara broke out of her husband's arms and expressively raised her hand with the phone, showing it to the whole office. "No, why? I want everyone to know what a wonderful man you are," she emphasized the word wonderful. "A decent boss and a faithful husband." Kieran clutched his head, ashamed of his wife. "And you," Barbara pointed her finger at Stacy, Kieran's assistant, "should be ashamed of yourself for messing around with another man's husband." "Barbara, stop it." Kieran grabbed his wife in an armful and dragged her forcefully into his office. Let me go, you traitor." Barbara lashed out, hitting her hand on the door. Angry, Kieran sat his wife in a chair and, looming over her, asked, "Here, even if there's such urgency, why this show-off? What are you trying to accomplish?" Barbara looked at him with eyes red with rage and tears. She poked her husband in the face again with the work phone with the message. How do you explain this? Sleeping with your young assistant. It's all clear. The old wife is no longer honored. You've gone completely insane. Kieran rubbed the bridge of his nose and exhaled. Obviously, someone got the wrong number in the heat of correspondence. I even know who that redhead you come home with in your hair. God, you have nothing better to do than look for other people's hair on my shirts. Kieran rolled his eyes. Find something more productive to do. And Stacy has a fiancé, for your information. You call your Stacy's number, and we'll see if she's wrong, Barbara demanded with clenched fists. Everything inside her was churning with rage, responding with a new wave to every phrase of her husband, her back, cheeks, and forehead burning. Kieran picked up his work smartphone and pressed the speakerphone during a call. The electronic voice of the answering machine came through the receiver. It rang several times, but to no avail. That doesn't prove anything, Barbara said. Barbara, go home. Please stop embarrassing me in front of my subordinates, Kieran asked in a very firm, quiet voice, turning away to the window. The girl felt that her claims were being ignored, that it was as if everyone was laughing out loud at her without being embarrassed about it. Why? Why did it say the word boss? She threw back at Kieran, grabbing the doorknob. I have no idea. As if there weren't enough chiefs in Swan Town, Kieran replied without turning around. Barbara left her husband's office, and a dozen prying eyes stared at her. She walked briskly down the corridor without looking at anyone. On her way out of the building, she saw Stacy standing by the parking lot. She was being hugged and apparently comforted by some guy. Barbara froze for a moment, and then a wave came over her, burning her from the inside out. The tears she had been holding back for so long rushed from her eyes. It's okay, Kate said, counting the drops of valerian. Men are like that, tricky, but you don't have to cry about it. Appreciate your dignity. She handed Barbara a glass of water and a sedative to a shuddering Barbara. Kate arrived as soon as she heard her friend's unintelligible voice on the phone, mixed with crying. Kate, I've embarrassed him. She took the glass with shaking hands. And him and myself. I'm anticipating the news on their website. Editor's ex-wife breaks into office. God, what a shame. Barbara was in tears again. She hadn't been able to calm down for about an hour. Well, Kate said, at least you'll be remembered. Why do you have to go there anyway? I'm such an idiot. Barbara leaned into her friend's shoulder. We're all a little bit stupid. Kate put her hands on her head. Why did you call me this afternoon? Barbara realized that she couldn't take another confrontation today. I just wanted to chat, she said. Maybe go shopping? Well, we're not going anywhere now. No amount of foundation can hide your puffy eyes. I'm an expert, Kate said, raising her finger to the ceiling, which made Barbara smile a little. What are you going to do about Kieran? I don't believe in random texting, she persisted. I don't know, maybe I'm really paranoid. Barbara slumped into the back of the couch and stared at the ceiling. If that's the case, you should apologize. I'd still fight it, Kate persisted. It was reckless of him to sleep with his almost secretary. It's like a joke situation. There's someone else here for sure. I'll talk to him if I can. Barbara exhaled. For some reason, she dialed the number she had copied from her husband's phone again, and once again it responded with the monotonous muttering of an electronic voice. Kieran came home late that evening, but Barbara waited for him. Her husband looked at her glumly and, without a word, left for the shower. Kieran. I'm sorry. Barbara waited for him in the room. The man walked past her, shook his head. I'll forgive you, Barbara. Except that my reputation is ruined by this tantrum today. There'll be whispers behind my back, and I've given Stacy the day off. I was wrong, Kieran. Barbara sighed sadly, sitting down on the floor. I'm so ashamed. I was so ashamed. Kieran sat down on the other side of the sofa. You've turned into some kind of paranoiac looking for hair in my things, sniffing around for some stupid mistake by a stranger, throwing tantrums. Damn her. It just seemed to me that our relationship had grown cold, Barbara murmured quietly. "When it seems, my dear, it's customary to be baptized," said Kieran. "Have you decided to play the jealous wife?" The idea had failed. But Kate said. Barbara began. "Would you and Kate be in the yellow ward together with such ideas?" Her husband came at her again. "She's listening to someone who can't see what's under her nose. But she advises you, and God forbid she herself has a husband who walks left and right." Suddenly Kieran cut himself off half-phrased. It seemed that he had said something unnecessary, and now he was trying to take it back. Barbara's ears perked up. She squeezed the bridge of her nose with her fingers and covered her eyes, trying to calm down. "And anyway, don't talk to Kate about any of that nonsense. She's a bad influence on you," he said at last. Kieran stood up and left the room, signaling that the conversation was over. Barbara was left sitting alone in the dark, confused and full of doubt. Kieran knows something about Simon, but he keeps quiet. Male solidarity. Why is he suddenly so set against Kate? She thought. Barbara paid no attention to her husband's apparent coldness and his unwillingness to address the problem and forgive her. A week passed. Life went on as usual. Angie, the head doctor of the clinic, informed Barbara that she and 2 other young dentists were going to a 3-day conference in another city. The girl was even a little relieved at this turn of events. It might help to take her mind off her worries, although outwardly Barbara had no reason to worry. Her husband was friendly to her. Kate still called and chatted nonstop about everything. The patients hadn't diminished, but the appearance of well-being hid Kieran's frightening coldness, the fading passion, the exhausting work that took up all her energy. Barbara could never find the strength to talk to her friend about her husband. She had no proof other than her own suspicions. "I should get my family in order first," she thought. Kieran agreed that the trip would be good for his wife, and even bought her a train ticket. "Go have a rest, listen to intelligent people, relax and get rid of all the nonsense from your head," he told Barbara, while she was packing a travel bag. The train swayed gently on the tracks. Barbara rarely rode trains, and every time she did, it was a surprise. Her colleagues were arguing animatedly. Nearby, glasses rattled under the clatter of the wheels. "Maybe Kieran's right. I am overly suspicious. We've been together since we were 18, and there's never been any cause for jealousy," Barbara thought, looking out the window at the fir trees that flashed by at the station. And how many girls at the university were hanging around him? I didn't care much about it then. Yes, it was Kate's way of panicking herself and others. Whether it was the monotonous rocking that chased away the bad thoughts or the atmosphere of the trip, Barbara was in a pleasant mood. She laid her head down on the pillow that smelled of iron and fresh fabric. "I'll be back and we'll definitely go to Grandma's in Utah," Barbara decided and closed her eyes. Training in the company of the sun and sea really did the girl good. In the morning, she and her colleagues listened to seminars of experienced doctors and presentations of new materials, and in the afternoon they went to the beach to sunbathe and swim. The sea climate and fresh air seemed to erase the worries from her mind. Barbara thought about how she would return home, how she would tell Kieran about the trip, how then the 2 of them would go to the place where malachite was mined. "It's a shame Kate isn't with me," the girl thought, watching the waves. She said she hadn't been to the sea for a couple of years. Barbara really wanted to share the peacefulness with people close to her. After all, co-workers are only co-workers. On the 3rd day, the organizers said that the last speaker would not be able to come due to illness, apologized to the participants, and announced the closing of the training. Barbara decided not to stay another day in the hotel with the others, but bought a ticket for the same day and went home. "That'll be a surprise for Kieran. I'll arrive early." And with a tan too, she smiled as she looked out the window at the sea. The train arrived at its destination early in the morning. On the trip, Barbara had a nice chat with a neighbor and her 9-year-old grandson. Granny treated the girl to fruit and enjoyed listening to her stories about her work, remembering her own youth. The morning city was just waking up. The air washed by the night rain was not as warm as at the sea, and even a little fresh. Outside the cab window were still sleepy alleys and early joggers in the alleys. The first rays of sunshine dispersed the mist, the remnants of which played in the puddles, and the drops glistened on the bushes and tree branches. The cab driver helped Barbara unload her bag, wished her a good day, and drove off after the new passengers. She thought about how she would now go up to the apartment, go in quietly, and get into bed with a sleeping Kieran. How nice that today was her husband's day off and they could sleep through lunch together, then make coffee and talk about their upcoming trip. Barbara quietly turned the key in the lock so as not to wake Kieran. Quietly, she entered the apartment and, barely seeing the familiar hallway, was taken aback. All the good mood she'd brought with her from the sea had gone down and shattered into tiny pieces. Her heart was pounding like the wheels of the train that had brought her back here. There were shoes lying in the hallway that she would recognize out of 100. They'd bought them together last year and picked up the last pair in town. The shoes had been Kate's. At the mirror, however, Barbara saw her keys and an equally all too familiar car key fob. For a moment, a naive, childish thought crept into her head: what if something had happened, and Kate had come to ask for help? But that thought was immediately smothered under the pressure of the obviousness of what was happening. From the bedroom, Barbara heard soft voices. It seemed to her that her heart was pounding so loudly that the neighbors could hear it. The girl crept quietly to the door and froze, listening to what was going on behind it. "I almost talked him into leaving Stacy completely," said a familiar female voice. "The divorce will be finalized as soon as the official deal is done," Kieran's voice replied. "Same day," the woman confirmed. "And when are you going to file the papers?" There was a sigh. "I think." The idea of a fake affair had failed. Barbara entered the apartment before she could turn the key. There were shoes lying in the hallway that she would have recognized out of 100. They'd bought them with Kieran last year and picked up the last pair in town. The shoes were Kate's. By the mirror lay her keys and a familiar car fob. For a moment, a naive thought crept into my head that maybe something had happened and Kate had come to ask for help. But that thought vanished immediately under the weight of the obviousness of what was happening. Quiet voices came from the bedroom. Barbara crept to the door and froze, listening. "I almost talked him into leaving Stacy completely," said a familiar female voice. "We'll get the divorce finalized as soon as the official deal is done," Kieran's voice replied. The same day, the woman confirmed. "And when are you going to file the documents?" There was a sigh. "I think." "The fake treason idea failed," Kieran said with annoyance. "It failed because someone left their work phone at home," a woman's voice interrupted reproachfully. "I've been working her as hard as I can. A little more, and she would have filed for divorce herself. And we would have gotten away with it. And now it is necessary either to speak in the forehead or something else to think up." "Head on," came the answer after a pause. "It's a pity. I don't like her as a woman, but as a human being I pity her. And to make a show is not pitiful." With a chuckle, said the interlocutor. "The lesser of two evils. My choice," the man's voice said with a chuckle. Barbara clamped her hands over her mouth, feeling the corners of her eyes moisten. A wave of cold rolled down her back. Her cheeks flared with heat, and her throat felt like it was being squeezed in the grip of an invisible hand. The realization came in pieces, each one more repulsive than the last, burning away all the good inside like acid. "Kieran, you and I met back in college." Kate's voice was quiet, ingratiating. "But you were too right then, and I was too stupid. But if it had worked, there wouldn't have been all these years, divorces, other husbands, and everything would be easier now. We'd be living abroad somewhere by now. If it works out, it will," Kieran confirmed. "We'll manage the salon and the agency remotely." Barbara felt her tears wet her shirt, leaving a hot, wet trail on her chest. "When we're gone, maybe they'll do something about the marriage thing." Kate laughed from behind the door. "I've seen the way he looks at her, it's perfect. He likes dumplings and borscht and soap operas at night. She's never been as good as you." "She loves her job and doesn't like herself very much," said Kieran. "We live like neighbors. I'm tired of the homegirl who always has everything planned. I feel like an old man around her. I want something different." "I know what you want," Kate said. "Family. Freedom." There was a commotion. Barbara sat against the wall outside the door, shaking with shame, pity, disgust, resentment, and a sense of betrayal by the two people she thought closest to her after her mother. The cold hands of reality finally closed around her throat. She jumped up and flung herself out of the apartment. Out into the street, into the morning. Barbara ran and ran, fleeing from the shame, an embarrassment she had lived in for so many years. She was disgusted with her own existence and wanted to forget, to erase her memory. To go back 10 years, to not reach out, to find others, to send the smug Kieran away. Every year that passed felt like it was whipping her in the back, leaving deep wounds and causing the pain to grow worse and worse. Tears covered her eyes, everything was cloudy and barely recognizable. She stopped to catch her breath and ran again. Passers-by heard her screams, but Barbara neither saw nor heard them. She wanted to hide from this vile feeling, from herself. Girl, look out. It was the last scrap of reality that imprinted itself on her memory before pain and darkness consumed her. The peaceful sounds of a squeak snapped Barbara out of oblivion. She thought irritably at first, what's that nasty squeak that sounds like the trills of an electronic alarm clock from the 90s? Her eyes opened with difficulty. Her body felt like absorbent cotton. My right leg felt like it was made of stone and wouldn't move. My entire right side responded with a painful tingling sensation when I tried to turn around on the bed. My head was buzzing. "Good morning. You're finally awake." Barbara, the woman in the white coat, greeted her. Barbara looked around and only then realized that she was in a hospital bed. What happened to me? She looked at the leg in a cast sticking out from under the blanket. "You were hit by a car," the doctor said, looking at the paperwork. "I'm surprised you got away with a broken leg, a mild concussion, and moderate bruising. Others in such cases are put together in pieces. Were you born with your shirt on? The family will be happy to know you're on the mend." Not all the family. Barbara turned her back to the wall. "Will someone come to call your relatives?" The doctor asked. "Tell my husband that I was hit by a car and died. I can't go back. I don't want to see him again, and I don't want to see her ever again." "I beg you," Barbara said without turning around. The doctor shook her head. "If they come, don't let them in my room," Barbara added. The hospital was dreary, but the walls with the Red Cross seemed to distract her from the painful thoughts of what had happened. The physical pain didn't seem to bother her as much as the tearing of her soul. The mother rushed to the hospital half an hour after the call. She was first upset, then cursing, then crying at her daughter's bedside. Barbara told her everything she had heard that morning. Lexi left her daughter's room, slipped the nurses boxes of candy, and threatened to complain to the head doctor, ordering her not to let anyone with names beginning with the letters M and K see her daughter. Barbara blocked the numbers of her husband and the lying friend. She asked her mother and a coworker friend to pick up her belongings from her husband's apartment when he was away. Doctors said rehabilitation would take about 3 weeks. The fracture would finally heal in 3 months. One day there was a knock on the room door. Barbara thought it was one of the staff, although they usually didn't bother to knock. "Come in," she shouted, not taking her eyes off the magazine her mother had brought. "Hello, Barb," came a familiar voice. Simon stood in the doorway with a bouquet of flowers, and when she saw Barbara's robe thrown over her shoulders, she had mixed feelings. Seeing her ex-girlfriend's husband reminded her of what had happened. On the other hand, it was as if he had nothing to do with it. "You don't know how hard it is for me to get here," the man complained, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "They're practically checking IDs to get to you." "That's my request," Barbara nodded. "Why are you hiding from someone?" Simon joked. "Maybe I am the girl confirmed." Simon stared at her in surprise. His eyes were filled with question and incomprehension. Barbara exhaled and decided to tell him. She remembered everything Kate at the Institute, her consumerist attitude toward men, and the hypocrisy of her friend. Simon listened with his mouth open. "I don't want you to fall victim to their game. Divorce soon and don't listen to any pleas. A salon? Don't you dare buy one. Kate is using you and has been using you," Barbara finished. "How do you know that?" Simon asked, stunned, not believing his ears. They talked about it for a long time. She asked him not to tell anyone where she was or what was wrong with her, and not to do anything stupid that would ruin his life. Toward the end, as Simon was leaving, he asked, "Barb, tell me, do I have a chance?" "Not now," she shook her head. "I want to be alone. Maybe in the future. Maybe." "I understand. Get well soon." And I'll come by, if you don't mind. Simon nodded. Come, she blinked, showing her agreement. Time passed differently in the country than it did in the city. It's measured and quiet. The hustle and bustle are alien to those who are used to getting up to the crowing of the rooster. A light frost touched the rowan berries, which shone against the snow with bright lights. The sun disappeared behind the horizon. The fresh snow had not yet been trampled by anyone's feet and paws. "Granddaughter, there's a letter for you," Angie shouted as she came in, waving the envelopes. "Thank you," Barbara shouted from the kitchen. She was making a simple breakfast for herself and her grandmother. "It's been a long time since I've seen a letter," Angie said, sitting down on a stool. "You young people are all on your gadgets, and you've given up writing." She handed Barbara an envelope. She took a quick glance at the sender's name and decided to read it later. After she recovered, Barbara went straight to her grandmother's house in Swan Village. She could not stay in the city, where every street reminded her of the betrayal and shame she had experienced. The girl quit her job, took care of other minor matters. She made her mother her representative in the divorce proceedings, so she wouldn't have to face Kieran again. "Out of sight, out of mind," her mother said as she saw her off. "Go as you like, and come back as you like. Just call often," her mother said to Barbara before she left. It was quiet in Swan Village. There the pain began to subside and gradually recede. Time was doing its work, healing the wounded soul. Her mother didn't talk about Kieran and the divorce, only promised to tell her when it was over. The envelope had Simon's address and name on it. How he knew where to find her remained a mystery. Barbara ran her eyes cursorily over the lines. Simon had written about the divorce, about leaving Kate nearly destitute. That part of the letter she deliberately skipped. "Dear Barb, I realize I'm probably an extra person in your life, but since that night at the hospital you haven't left my mind. I've made a lot of mistakes and missed a lot of chances, but I don't want to let you go." The girl paused, listening to herself. Something faintly trembled in her after those words. "I'm willing to wait as long as you say. I hope for an answer. Simon." Barbara folded the letter, tucked it away in an envelope, and began to twirl it in her hands. If she had still had doubts at the hospital, she knew for sure now. Angie came into the room, thinking of what to say to him. She looked at her granddaughter's focused face. "I think old suitors aren't invited into a new life." Barbara smiled at her grandmother, tearing open the envelope. She tossed the scraps into the trash can and looked out the window. "Grandma, the neighbor's probably here to ask about Vince again. She's so restless, she's already got her hands full." The older woman nodded. "They're all worried about Sami.